The victim lost $13 million at the casino.
There's all kinds of sketchy people she's been associating with at the casino. There's no telling where she is.
The community, the neighbors, did a lot of their own searching for her.
I haven't heard from Clark. He's not here today.
You'd be looking for your mom, wouldn't you?
He was her son, and she was always going to love him.
Wait. That's the color hair she had.
That was very strong evidence. But the hardest part is the conviction. We didn't have the eyewitness, and there was no DNA proof.
You never know what's going to happen in a jury trial. Never.
The jury has a verdict. About to go see what they said.
For those most affected by a homicide, the first 48 is just the beginning. This is the story of the fight for justice in the weeks, months, and years.
Biloxi police are looking for a missing Alabama woman. Authorities say Kay Atkins Rains of Mobile, Alabama, was last seen at the Beau Rivage Casino in Biloxi and the Home Depot in Gulfport on Sunday. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Biloxi Police Department.
Kay's employer reported her missing 5 days ago. Now, Biloxi PD refers the case to Mobile homicide.
All right, let me give you a rundown real quick. On Sunday, Kay Rains gets up and goes to work. She works at Home Depot in Biloxi part-time. She gets off work sometime in the afternoon around 1 o'clock. According to her phone records, she was driving home. She since then has not been heard from by any friends or family.
Okay. What happened? I want to know. I want to figure that out. It's not just a job to us. I'm Sergeant Kenneth Gillespie. How do you know? We take a personal interest in every case that we work. We take that person on as like one of our own family members.
68-year-old Kay Atkins Rains grew up in Mobile and graduated from the University of Alabama. She started a program for disadvantaged children at the Mobile Mental Health Center before leaving to begin a family with her husband, Ron.
Apparently, she's a high roller gambler. Spends a lot of time at the Beau Rivage and always has a standing room. According to Biloxi PD, the victim lost $13 million at the casino.
That's crazy.
She was at the casinos and had come back to Mobile, and now she's missing. She's never done it before. There was no other reports of that.
Biloxi PD's working on getting all the video from the Beau Rivage, so that way we can get it and review it. Right now, my thinking is we need to do a search warrant on the house. I say that's probably priority. We're also told that her neighbor is actually a retired lieutenant from the police department.
I reached out to him and asked him, you mind coming in and kind of giving us some background information on Kay Rains?
Going to investigate it as a homicide as of right now.
While the team prepares a search warrant for Kay's house.
All right. Your first name is Bruce, right?
Yes.
How long has Miss Kay lived next to you?
8 or 9 years.
Because I was retired and with the police department, I knew that they were going to do a full court press on this, putting all the resources they had into the case.
Now, does she have any kids?
Yes, Clark.
I've known the son since he was a little kid. He was always coming over to play with my kids.
He says that Kay's adult son recently moved back into the house.
Her son had problems.
What kind of problems did he have?
Drugs. He had already been in multiple rehabs. Several years ago, he went a little nuts. But over the last year, he has been on medication. She has been very excited about how he's been acting.
He's been there a year, and there's been no issues at all.
You know of any other incidents where she's picked up and left or missing?
No. Kay did have a gambling issue.
After her husband died, Kay would go to Biloxi and Las Vegas and gamble. Her husband made really good money.
Ron Rains was a partner with a multinational accounting firm. After his death in 2006, Kay gambled away millions of dollars over a period of several years.
Well, I always found it strange when she had to get a job. Something, reality hit her in the face that I may not have enough to live on the rest of my life.
We're going to go over to the house, search the house, and speak to her son right now. You ready?
3 hours in,
Nice houses over here. It's gonna be the next house.
You go to the side. He's coming to the door. Hey, are you Clark?
Yes.
Hey, you mind step out here and talk to us for a minute?
Sure.
Do me a favor, just turn around. Put your hands up on the wall for me. I'm just gonna check you, make sure you don't have any weapons. How you doing today, man? You doing all right?
Yeah, I'm right.
Were you by yourself, bro?
Yeah.
Where's your mom at?
Last time I saw her was at, waiting for the casino.
Have you talked to her since then? Clark was like, no big deal. You know, mom's been gone for a little bit, but this is normal. When was the last time you talked to her?
4 or 5 days.
You can relax. 4 or 5 days ago? We already knew, talking to Bruce, that this isn't normal. Well, we just want to look around and make sure she's not here and everything like that, okay? And then we're going to go talk to you after that. Let's just walk out here and, hey, Dwayne, we're going to take him up to our office and talk to him. Come on, Stan. Let's see what we can find. This is her room.
Look at that. She didn't leave that like that.
There were clothes all over the place. It looked like somebody had been looking for something in that room.
Her purse and wallet's right here.
What?
Here's her bank card.
If you were to get away without telling anybody, or you didn't want to be found, those were all the things that you would have taken with you.
Yeah. Ah, that might be her phone. Underneath her bed sheet.
It solidified that this isn't just a missing person case.
You see there was a red roller in her room?
Yeah.
In Kay's bedroom, they find a suitcase fully packed with her clothes.
His room's like nothing's wrong.
His wallet, little bed.
His phone's in here.
We'll take the phones. Dude, this is crazy, man. Hey, Sarge, me and Nick are gonna head back and start interviewing him. They're gonna continue looking through the house and trying to see if they can find any traces of blood.
5 hours in,
We want to just talk to you a little bit about your mom. You know, trying to find out if she's okay and see where she's at.
There's no telling where she is. There's all kinds of sketchy people she's been associating with at a casino.
We just try to gauge and watch somebody and learn their mannerisms. And we were a little alarmed just that he didn't seem to be concerned.
We're just trying to ask you some information about your mother.
Yeah, I'm not gonna do that.
If it was my mother, I would want to be answering as many questions as I could.
I just want to make sure I don't get found guilty of something I'm innocent of. That's all.
All right. That's your decision, okay?
Right.
So, you know, that's fine. Just sit tight for us, all right?
Something's not right.
He was just real calm, just didn't seem to be bothered by the fact that people are looking for his mom. It's definitely strange, very strange.
Six hours into the investigation,
After meeting and talking to Clark, I want to go further into this investigation and find out what's going on because something's not right.
while Gillespie has Clark waiting at homicide. He heads back to Kay's house to check on the search for blood evidence.
Y'all did the spray in there?
Yeah.
Have you done the car too? Nothing?
They're checking the house for anything that would show that maybe there was a struggle there, maybe something happened there, and maybe just Clark cleaned it up.
Dude, where is she and where the hell did it happen at? There's no trace of anything in the house as far as her. You know, we hadn't seen any blood or anything. We're gonna end up having to let him go. We're gonna see what we can do is maybe get a court order to put a tracker on the car.
In this situation, we didn't have a crime scene, but we felt like she was dead. So we decided to put a tracker on his mom's car to be able to monitor where he goes, what he's doing. Maybe he'll take us to wherever his mom is.
This is the first case I've ever had where I didn't have the body. Makes it a little more difficult. We don't know how she was killed, and we don't even know where she was killed. It's definitely a challenge.
15 hours in.
No passcode.
Detectives get access to Kay's phone.
There's a call that goes to MoneyGram.
Kay's phone was used to call a wire transfer service.
We can get that voice recording from MoneyGram.
I'll put in a request for it.
When we saw that, obviously it was like, well, that's odd. We got to see what's going on here. Maybe this will help answer some questions. Maybe she sent somebody some money.
27 hours in, with the warrant for the tracker in hand.
Right now we're heading back over to Clark Raines' house. The plan is one of our guys puts a tracker on the car.
This was the first time that we had used a tracker on a homicide case.
Hey man, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Hey, is your mom showed up today? Has she called or anything?
Nope.
As they're installing the tracking device,
What we're gonna do is is that your alarm? You never heard the alarm before? That's all right, man. Well, come back over here for a minute.
I mean, it was definitely a little nerve-wracking at that moment with that alarm going off. I'm just like, what is going on? Did he set an alarm off? Does he have an alarm around the car? The biggest thing about it is we didn't want Clark to know that that tracker was on the car.
Do you mind if I just ask you a question about your mom? Is she known to stay gone for days at a time? Or?
I wouldn't say it's like 100% usual, but sometimes, yeah.
We just want to try to find her, okay? For a second, I thought we set the alarm off on the car. Come to find out, it was actually the alarm on the house. Hello?
the tracker was successfully placed on the car.
Appreciate it. Bye. Now, whenever Clark leaves the house, we're going to know exactly where he goes. And hopefully he'll lead us to Kay.
Back at Homicide, the security video from the Beau Rivage Casino has arrived.
Here's Kay arriving at the casino. She's got that red suitcase that we found in her bedroom. This has got to be the last time she checked in before she went missing. And she's there by herself. Now, this is Sunday morning. It looks like Kay's leaving, but she doesn't have the suitcase with her. She must have been planning on coming back. All right, so here's Sunday night. That's Clark right there. There's Clark getting off on her floor where she was staying.
When we see Clark pop up on there, obviously he's like, okay, well, all right, what's he doing there? His mom's not with him. Why is he there? It was very alarming.
Hours after she goes missing, Clark goes to the casino and takes her stuff out of her room. Something had to have happened by now. It's just hard to believe anyone would kill their own mother, but I'm starting to think that's what we have here.
Kay, she was always smiling. My name's Libby Fillingham. We were friends for 17 years. She loved him very much. She really loved him. Kay had what she called a magical childhood, and she wanted Clark to have the magical childhood that she had. Oh, that's sweet when he was little. Kay would say, look how handsome my son is, and she'd grab him and, you know, put her arm around him, and she'd say, isn't he good looking? He's so big and tall and good looking. And I guess they were happier times, you know. And Kay looks happy in the picture, and she looks very proud of him there. It looks like the perfect photos. But Clark made some bad choices, to say the least. But anyway, she would try to, you know, keep him out of jail and keep him off drugs. And she would spend hours on the phone trying to get him in rehabs versus jail. And I think she kept thinking, well, this time he's going to get straight. This time it's going to be different. And I don't know, I don't think it ever worked out that way. Hard to believe.
We should have his cell phone records back pretty soon.
As the first 48 hours slip away,
If we had the body, we could probably resolve this case, but we don't. Without having the body, we need a confession from Clark.
for the next 2 days, the team continues to track Clark's movements. Then,
he's at the front desk.
Clark unexpectedly shows up at homicide.
Oh, what's going on, man?
Oh, I just came by to get my wallet.
Okay. Just give me a couple days and we'll get it back to you.
All right.
Any ideas where we can find your mom at?
Wishful thinking, she wanted to go get her together. She spent $1.5 million and considered her in a 2-year period.
On gambling?
Yeah.
When Clark mentions his mom's lost millions of dollars at the casinos, that's where we start to develop the motive. Clark feels like this is his inheritance money that his mom has spent, that he's entitled to. Definitely be a reason for Clark to kill his mom.
Did you go anywhere Sunday night?
No, they go sleep like 10.
We kind of play dumb at first because when we're interviewing him, we don't want him to know that we know everything.
Didn't you go to the Beau Rivage? No. Well, you know, the thing is, Clark, there's video of you there Sunday evening.
At the Beau Rivage?
Yeah.
No,
Yes, you were. I'm telling you were because I saw you on video.
okay, now that I might have went with her to the Beau Rivage.
When you lie about something, you have to tell another lie to keep that lie seem believable.
You go into her room and get her belongings out of her room.
Oh, yeah, I grabbed her stuff. Yeah, it was a suitcase. She has me do that all the time.
And then next thing you know, you're telling another lie to tell another lie, and it's just a downward spiral.
Okay, so where was your mom at when you went in that room?
I don't know. She was either Like at that other casino, like cashing out, or?
No, not at all.
Her wallet's at the house. Everything of hers is at the house. And you hadn't even tried to look for her. That's a problem.
You know what has happened to your mom.
Yeah. I'll tell you what happened to her.
I really kind of thought Clark was going to take us to her at that point.
You know, her head off to the point where she's a completely different person. I don't know where she is still. It's only been 9 days. So I'm sure she'll show up.
He just continued to lie throughout this entire investigation. I don't think I've ever interviewed anybody like Clark Rains before.
He basically just walked out of here without a care in the world, like he's gonna get away with it.
There's no body and there's no crime scene. Are we ever gonna find her?
If he says something to an officer, I need you to note the time and what he said. Okay. Okay. This case was very interesting to me because it's in what I would consider to be my community. I'm Ashley Rich. I'm the elected district attorney of the 13th Judicial Circuit in the state of Alabama. The whole community was pretty much shocked. Kay was just a lovely person who enjoyed living in Mobile and got along with all of her neighbors and lived a quiet life.
After 10 days, with no sign of Kay,
We're gonna start on that dirt road in that industrial area, and I thought, you know,
The community, the neighbors, were all upset. What was real unusual about this case is the neighbors and the people that knew her did a lot of their own searching for her.
just as a friend, I don't wanna not try. Because I don't wanna know I did everything I could.
People came from all over to try to help find her. We were just doing anything we could.
If she disappeared Sunday night, nobody would have been back here. I'm thinking maybe she's in some marsh.
I just kept thinking, like, what if she's stranded somewhere or, you know, if somebody's kidnapped her? I mean, your mind's just racing. You're trying to think anything you think of.
We can't sleep at night not knowing where she is and what's happened to her.
I understood people wanting to help. I understood her friends feeling helpless. But I knew everything that could be done was being done.
I haven't heard from Clark. He's not here today. Nobody's heard from him.
I thought, that's a little odd. You know, you'd be looking for your mom, wouldn't you? I mean,
back at headquarters,
They just sent us the audio recording from MoneyGram. MoneyGram received a phone call from Kay Rains' account to transfer money right after she disappears.
Thanks for calling MoneyGram. I'm trying to send money.
It's Clark.
Can I have your name?
My name is K-A-Y, Rain, R-A-I-N-E-S. I'm trying to send money and I didn't get the text confirmation.
One of the most alarming things in this case was listening to that MoneyGram phone call. Clark Rains attempting to send money to his own account and giving MoneyGram his mom's information.
Can I have your date of birth?
My birthday is?
Yes.
9/19/48.
The transaction was rejected by your financial institution.
Okay, thank you.
He's definitely trying to wire himself $800. Everything always ends up pointing back to Clark.
In the search of the house, we found her iPhone under the covers of her bed. We found the Apple laptop in Clark Rains' cell. We had a tremendous amount of circumstantial evidence. You took possession of the cell phones in the search warrant because you wanted to take them to the technology center.
To be examined.
And you had to do a search warrant affidavit for those.
Right.
Okay. Gillespie did discuss the amount of evidence he had, and it just wasn't enough. We knew that we needed to make this the strongest case possible.
Almost 2 months after Kay's disappearance.
So this is where it showed his car to be.
The team discovers that the day before, the tracker on Clark's car traveled to a remote region northeast of Mobile.
Kind of off the road in the woods. He was there for about 15 minutes. And then he comes back out, turns around and goes back home.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting there.
What was Clark doing? Why was he out there? We're heading up to Baldwin County to an area where Clark went to yesterday. So it's got to be right about here. This is probably where he went off. A little bit back that way. See a little cut in the road that goes to a trail that goes back into the woods. And so kind of pull up and park and get out, and we start walking on foot. We start walking down this road. And I see an area of the ground where the vegetation just doesn't look right. Wait. The topsoil looks darker than the rest of the ground around it. We're gonna have to get some people up here and dig it up. We might have found something out here.
Gillespie calls to get assistance from the crime scene unit and the forensic archaeological team.
I appreciate it.
His hair?
Right there. Right there.
That's the color hair she had. I'm starting to believe that it's Kay Raines. Back just a hair into it.
Just real quick.
Yeah.
Human.
Yeah, okay. We have a team up there that's digging it up. Move a little bit more, and that's when we start to realize it looks like a hand.
The search for Kay Raines may finally be over.
The news is gonna get wind that we found the body, and Clark's probably gonna find out. And my concern is he's gonna run. And so it's like, we gotta get him now. We might have found her. I'm dead serious.
Gillespie puts the word out to pick up Clark.
Blows my mind. Why come back up here, though? If he had buried it here once already.
Maybe we just want to make sure she was still here.
Right. I'm obviously a little bit in disbelief. I mean, you know, the more time that goes by and we hadn't found her, I just felt like we weren't going to find her.
Y'all have him stop?
Clark is taken into custody.
We're going to go back to police headquarters and interview him again and see if he's ready to tell us what happened to his mom. Have a seat right here, Clark. Here's the bottom line. We've had a tracker on your vehicle this whole time. Yesterday, when you drove up to where you went, it tracked you going up there. I want you to look at this right here. You took us to your mom's grave yesterday.
I didn't drive anywhere.
You did, Clark. You did. There's no doubt in that. We can prove that. So get that out of your head and quit lying to us.
No, I didn't go anywhere.
I'm gonna get up and I'm gonna walk out this room. And your opportunity will then be over. Your chance to tell your side of the story will be done. So you're fine with that?
Yeah.
It's hard to even imagine somebody that would do something like that to their own mother, the one person that raised him and has taken care of him since he was born.
The day the body is found, Clark is charged with Kay Raines' murder.
Clark, did you want to say anything? You know what happened to your mother?
Kay's body is identified by her dental records, and the autopsy reveals disturbing details.
The fact that you kill your mother alone is brutal, but the fact that he did it the way he did and strangled her with his bare hands, looking at her, is disgusting.
When he dumped the body, he covered his mother up, face down in a shallow grave, with her arms and legs behind her, almost in the hogtie position. It was incredibly heartbreaking to hear that someone would do this to their own mother. These are her tax returns showing her amounts. Detective Gillespie is very diligent about knowing that his job doesn't stop just because an arrest has been made. The second phase of their job is to work with the prosecution to make sure the prosecution has all the tools that they need to effectively prosecute this case. We had boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of documents. And as we began sifting through all that paperwork, we were creating the relationship between Clark and Kay, as Kay being the loving mother willing to do whatever it took to help her son, and Clark Rains being the entitled adult who just took from her. But the hardest part is the conviction. Jurors want an eyewitness, a video, a murder weapon, DNA. And in this case, we did not have any of those things. And so I was not confident.
Clark Rains accused of strangling his own mother, then dumping her body 5 years ago. And now he's finally going to get his day in court.
Day one of the trial.
So I'm heading down to the courthouse this morning, butterflies in your stomach, because this isn't just about me, this is about Kay Rains. And the last thing I want to do is let her down, to be able to get justice for her.
I felt like we had a strong case, but I felt like I had a lot to do to make sure the jury understood, because this is a circumstantial evidence case.
You never know what's going to happen in a jury trial. Never.
Day two, 8:20 a.m.
They filed this last night? No.
Before opening statements even begin,
Search is a violation of the defendant's Fourth Amendment rights as the officers failed to comply with the terms of the warrant and requirements of the Code of Alabama.
Clark's defense motions to strike a key piece of evidence.
When officers get a search warrant for a vehicle tracker, within 10 days of when the tracker is removed from the vehicle, they must issue a return back to the judge, telling the judge that the tracker has been removed. It just irritates me because this tracking device was on that car. It's been provided to Discovery 3 years ago. They just get around to, hey, good morning, at 8:20 in the morning, in trial, filing a motion. So it looks like we're gonna have pre-trial motions. Ridiculous.
If the court decides in favor of the motion, the state's case could be thrown out.
A mistrial would have been devastating to all of us that had worked so long to prepare for trial.
Judge J. York weighs in.
The court held that that was not a fatal flaw with the search warrant and that the evidence could still come into trial.
Day 4 of the trial.
A little nervous about it, just because anytime we get up there to testify, you just want to make sure that you say all the right things and don't misspeak on anything.
Gillespie testifies that the day before Clark visited his mother's burial site, the tracker logged a stop at Home Depot.
We find the surveillance video where he purchases 10 bags of potting soil. He also drives behind a shopping center to the dumpster behind the H&R Block. And when I get there and I see the empty bags of potting soil and a little shovel, I knew right then he pulled back here to throw this stuff away.
And it was very evident when the detective first got to the scene that there was fresh soil that had been placed on her grave that did not have the same consistency as the soil in the area. And so we had the experts come in at trial and say the topsoil on the grave matched the topsoil found in the topsoil bags.
But despite all the evidence,
We didn't have the eyewitness. We didn't have anybody in the room when Clark killed her. There were no videos, and there was no DNA proof.
Day 7.
And, you know, what do we have to lose?
Right.
At this point? I mean, you know.
D.A. Rich and Gillespie face the possibility that they may need to settle for a plea deal.
A hung jury is what we have to lose. The only way we ensure not a hung jury is if we offer murder in life.
That is, a life sentence with parole.
The more I think about it, it's almost like, you know, there'd be a possibility that he could still get out.
Oh, for life?
Right.
He'll get out.
And so, you know, if we've got an opportunity for him to get life without,
right,
and never get out of jail,
right,
you know, can never get out of prison, then I just think.
Because we know based on his history, we know based on his drug abuse, he will continue to commit crimes. If he gets out, he will continue to commit crimes.
And what are your thoughts?
This is a really bad word to use in this case, but I'm a gambler.
Well, which way to gamble?
To gamble for life without? Yeah.
Let's do it. I'm down.
They decide not to offer Clark a plea deal.
The only choices that the judge has is life or life without the possibility of parole. We wouldn't be doing our job as effectively for Kay if we settled for life. We would rather take our chances with the judge in hopes that he will be convinced to give Clark life without the possibility of parole.
The jury begins deliberations.
I know for a fact that Clark Rains did this, but trying to convince 12 other people that, at the same time with having the defense take all the doubt they can, throw it at the jury and just hope something sticks. You just never know how it's going to turn out. You never know if all it takes is one juror to change the outcome of the case.
You should never be confident because you have to do your job as a prosecutor and convince that jury. I've never been one to say I am confident that I'm going to get a verdict.
Day 8 of the trial. After 3.5 hours of deliberations.
The jury has a verdict, so about to go see what they said.
Whether the verdict is guilty, whether the verdict is not guilty, you put your heart and soul into prosecuting these cases, then you have to trust in the process and you have to trust the jury and hope that they will come up with the right decision.
What I'm feeling at the moment, you know, please, God, let this be the right verdict.
The judge reads the verdict. Clark Rains is found guilty of murdering his own mother.
Mobile man found guilty of hog-tying, then murdering his own mother. He's facing the possibility of either life or life without parole due to 3 prior convictions.
I don't know that I've, you know, ever felt or been as emotional about a verdict as I did in this case. Because I don't know what I would have done if they would have come back and said not guilty.
We took a chance, and I told you I was a gambler, and that was probably not the right word to use, but that's what you do, and, you know, you have to take a chance, and you have to have faith, and we both had faith together, and I really appreciate that, and we did that together. You worked so hard to get 12 members of the community to agree, and they did, that Clark Rains was guilty of the highest offense, which is murder. We now have to put our fate in the hands of a judge in hopes that he will be convinced to give Clark life without the possibility of parole.
5 months after the verdict.
So today is the coup de grace, and it's important for us. Will we be disappointed if the judge gives him a life sentence? Absolutely. Then the defendant will be eligible for parole after 15 years. So he potentially could only have to serve 15 years. And that's not enough for this crime. It's just absolutely not enough. So today we will see if our gamble pays off.
I am a little nervous about it. I am a little anxious to see what the judge decides, but I'm really hoping that he gives them life without.
We'll see. Now we take our chances with the judge.
Yep.
There's only 2 sentences that can be passed down, and I'm hoping it's the one that keeps him there for the rest of his life.
5.5 years after Kay Raines was reported missing, Clark Raines is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
We did it. And we were right.
Yeah.
Thank God. There was a little concern that we weren't going to be right.
Gamble paid off?
Oh, yeah, the gamble paid off. Oh, yeah, the gamble paid off, for sure, for sure. And I just think, I really, truly believe, because he didn't show any remorse today, and he didn't say, I'm sorry, that that's what tipped the judge. I really do.
We got exactly what we came here for. It definitely was what Kay deserved in this situation, was for justice, you know, and for Clark to be locked up where he can never see the light of day again.
I'm not going to stand up and cheer. Clark's life's over and Kay's gone, so just nothing to be happy about all the way around. There is relief that she's with Ron. That's a good thing, that she's with her husband.
No matter what Clark did, no matter what Clark said, he was her son. And she was always going to love him. Unfortunately, she loved him until the day he killed her.
I would be interested in sitting down with Clark one day and seeing if he would talk to me and just tell me what happened, because I still want to know. I want to hear him tell it. I don't think that day is going to be anytime soon, but I think this case will be with me for the rest of my life.
The first thing investigators noticed was not the blood, not the abandoned car, and not the body hidden beyond the tree line. It was the silence. At 5:17 on a cold October morning in 1987, the eastern edge of a small Texas community seemed frozen in place. No traffic, no porch lights, no voice, just a pale fog hanging over the fields and a battered sedan sitting beside an empty county road with its driver's door open. The engine was still warm. The headlights were still on, and inside the vehicle, a paper cup of coffee had tipped into the passenger seat, its contents soaking into the upholstery as if someone had simply vanished between one breath and the next. By sunrise, the road would be covered with patrol cars. By noon, the entire county would be talking, and by nightfall, investigators would realize they were looking at something far more disturbing than a missing person. They were looking at the beginning of a mystery that would survive for nearly 4 decades. The woman behind the wheel was 24-year-old Laura Bennett, a receptionist at a dental clinic in the nearby town. She had left work the previous evening shortly after 6. Her co-workers remembered nothing unusual. She had laughed with them. She had complained about the weather. She had mentioned stopping at a convenience store before driving home. Then she disappeared. Laura never reached her house. Her mother called police before midnight, certain something was wrong. Laura never missed work. She never disappeared without calling. She never left her car abandoned on a rural road. At 5:31 the next morning, a rancher named Clyde Mercer spotted the sedan. He thought it belonged to someone who had broken down. He slowed his pickup. He saw the open door. He saw the coffin. Then he noticed a single shoe lying several yards away in the grass. He called the sheriff. What followed would become one of the most haunting investigations in the county's history. The first officers moved carefully through the area. The road was narrow and almost completely surrounded by farmland. There were no houses nearby, no streetlights, no businesses, no security cameras. Whoever had approached Laura's car had chosen a place where almost nobody would see them. Then, at 6:02 a.m., an officer discovered a second shoe. 30 yards farther into the field, investigators found a torn piece of Laura's blouse caught on a thorn bush. Beyond it, the grass had been flattened in a long, irregular trail. The trail ended beneath a cluster of cedar trees. That was where they found her. Laura was lying on her side, partially concealed by weeds and branches. Her purse was nearby. Her wallet was still inside. Her jewelry was untouched. There was no obvious sign of robbery. Her keys were missing. The crime scene became silent. Forensic investigators photographed everything, every footprint, every broken branch, Every disturbance in the dirt, they collected fibers from Laura's clothing. They took scrapings beneath her fingernails. They searched the surrounding field for tire tracks and discarded objects. One detail immediately bothered them. Laura's car had not been parked there by accident. The vehicle sat at an angle facing away from the highway. The driver's door was open, but the keys were gone. The seat was pushed backward farther than Laura normally kept it. A detective noted that the position could indicate someone taller than Laura had been sitting behind the wheel. There was another detail. The passenger side window was lower. That made no sense. It was cold that morning. Laura had been driving alone. Unless she wasn't. By mid-morning, detectives were knocking on doors across the county. They wanted to know who had seen Laura after work. They wanted to know who had driven the county road that night. They wanted to know whether anyone had heard shouting, seen headlights, or noticed a strange vehicle. The answers were almost useless. One truck driver remembered seeing a dark pickup around 7:15 p.m. He could not identify the driver. A waitress at a roadside diner remembered a young woman matching Laura's description entering shortly after 7. But she could not be certain. The diner had been busy. The woman had stayed only a few minutes. A gas station attendant remembered Laura buying coffee. That witness was more certain. He remembered the exact words she had spoken. She had asked whether the back road toward her neighborhood was open. The attendant told her it was. Then Laura left. That was the last confirmed sighting. For detectives, the timeline was brutally short. Laura left work at approximately 6:08. She stopped for coffee around 7:02. Her car was found at 5:17 the next morning. Somewhere inside those 10 hours was the answer. But there was no answer in the evidence. Not yet. The investigation exploded across the county. Volunteers searched fields and drainage ditches. Deputies questioned truckers, ranch hands, mechanics, bartenders, and anyone who had spent the night near the highway. Newspapers ran Laura's photograph on their front pages. Her family appeared on local television asking for information. Someone had killed a young woman. Someone had moved her body. Someone had driven her car. And someone knew why. The sheriff's office received dozens of calls. Most were worthless. One caller claimed to have seen a man arguing with Laura near a gas station. Another claimed Laura had been followed. A third insisted the killer was a local businessman. None of the stories could be verified. Then came the first serious suspect. His name was Daniel Cross. Cross worked as a mechanic and lived less than 10 miles from the crime scene. He drove a dark pickup. He was known to have been in the area the night Laura disappeared. He also had a history of violent arguments, though nothing had ever resulted in a serious criminal conviction. Detectives interviewed him twice. He denied knowing Laura. He denied seeing her. He denied driving along the county road. But investigators discovered that his truck had been repaired at a shop the following morning. The tires had been replaced. That seemed suspicious, until detectives learned why. Cross had blown a tire while hauling equipment 2 days earlier. The lead collapsed. Another suspect emerged. Then another. Each time, the same thing happened. The evidence pointed towards someone. Then the evidence disappeared. Weeks became months. The county stopped talking about the case every day. Laura's photograph disappeared from newspaper pages. Her family did not stop looking. They kept her bedroom exactly as she had left it. Her mother kept the porch light on. Her father carried Laura's photograph in his wallet. The case remained open. But open did not mean active. By 1989, the investigation had slowed to almost nothing. By 1992, the original detectives had moved on. By 1997, some of the evidence had been boxed and transferred to storage. The world changed. Technology changed. The people investigating Laura's murder grew old. Some retired. Some died. And the killer remained free. For years, there was only one thing that refused to disappear: a tiny biological trace collected from Laura's clothing. In 1987, investigators knew it was there. They simply did not know what it meant. The laboratory report described an unidentified male biological sample. The sample was preserved. It was placed into evidence. Then the case went cold. Not forgotten. Not abandoned. Cold. And that distinction would become important almost 30 years later, because in 2016, a new detective opened Laura Bennett's file and noticed something the original investigators could never have imagined. The evidence had never been destroyed. It was still there, and DNA technology had finally caught up with the crime. The detective requested a new forensic examination. The old sample was transferred under strict chain of custody procedure. Analysts extracted a partial genetic profile. It was incomplete, but it was enough to search. The first database comparison produced nothing. No match, no suspect, no name. The case appeared to remain exactly where it had been since 1987. Then investigators asked a different question. What if the killer had never entered a criminal database? What if he had never been arrested? What if the answer was hiding inside the family tree of someone who had? The investigation changed direction, and suddenly the dead had something to say. The DNA did not identify a killer immediately. It identified a possibility, a distant genetic connection to a man whose profile was already stored in a national database for an unrelated offense. The connection was not direct enough for an arrest. It was barely enough for investigators to begin building a family tree. They started with surnames, then locations, then ages, then relatives. One family kept appearing. The family had lived in Texas for generations, and one branch contained a man who had been 25 years old in 1987. His name was Michael Ray Carter. Investigators checked everything. Carter had lived within driving distance of Laura's workplace. He had owned a dark pickup. He had worked nights at a construction company. And according to employment records, he had been working near the county road during the same week Laura disappeared. It was not proof. It was coincidence. At least, that was what detectives told themselves. Carter was still alive. He was living in another state. He had never been publicly connected to Laura. He had never been charged. He had never been interviewed in the original investigation, and there was one reason for that. In 1987, nobody had put his name on the suspect list, not because he had an alibi, because nobody knew he existed. Investigators quietly began reconstructing Carter's life. They found photographs. They found old employment records. They found property documents. They found a marriage certificate. They found a divorce. They found traffic violations. They found almost 40 years of ordinary life. That was what disturbed investigators most. There was nothing cinematic about Michael Carter. He had not become a fugitive. He had not changed his name. He had not disappeared. He had simply continued living. He had bought a house. He had raised children. He had attended birthdays. He had gone to work. He had stood beside people who believed they knew him. And all the while, the answer to Laura Bennett's murder had been sitting somewhere inside his body. Investigators needed more. They could not arrest a man because a distant relative shared DNA with evidence from a 1987 crime. They needed his DNA. So they waited. Carter eventually threw away a drinking cup outside a restaurant. Investigators collected it. The laboratory compared the sample with the biological evidence preserved from Laura's clothing. The result came back 3 weeks later. The profiles were consistent. The probability was overwhelming. The cold case had a name. But investigators still needed to understand what had happened that night. They went back to the original timeline, and suddenly the strange details began connecting. Laura had asked about the back road. Carter's work crew had used that road. Laura's car had been moved. Carter's employer had reported a missing fuel card in the same week. And one witness, forgotten for decades, had once described a dark pickup parked near the field. The witness had never seen the driver clearly, but investigators found an old statement. The witness had remembered one unusual detail. The pickup had a damaged rear taillight. Carter's truck had a damaged rear taillight. The coincidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Detectives traveled to Carter's home. They did not announce why they were there. They simply knocked. When Carter opened the door, he was an older man. Gray hair, slow movements, a face that looked nothing like the photograph from 1987. But investigators knew what they were looking at. Not a photograph, not a memory. DNA. They asked him about Laura. Carter paused. Then he said he did not know anyone by that name. The interview continued. He denied being on the county road. He denied owning the truck. He denied knowing anything about the murder. But investigators already knew something he did not. They had his genetic profile. And this time, there was nowhere for the evidence to disappear. The official comparison returned a match. The biological evidence recovered from Laura's clothing was consistent with Carter's DNA at a level investigators described as extraordinarily strong. The news stunned the department. A case that had survived for nearly 40 years had finally reached a suspect. But solving a cold case is not the same as explaining it. Investigators still had to reconstruct the night. They believed Laura encountered Carter after leaving the convenience store. They believed he approached her car. They believed an argument or confrontation followed. They believed Laura was forced from the vehicle. Her shoes, the torn blouse, the disturbed grass, and the position of the car suggested movement from the roadside toward the tree. But there was no surviving eyewitness. No recording. No confession. No weapon. Only evidence that had waited decades to become meaningful. The prosecution's case depended on the past surviving the present. Laura's clothing. The old photographs. The witness statements. The vehicle records. The employment records. The DNA. Pieces scattered across 39 years. Carter was arrested. The announcement traveled through the community like an electric shock. People who had forgotten the case remembered it instantly. People who had grown up hearing Laura's name realized the woman from the old newspaper photograph was finally going to have her day in court. Laura's family received the news quietly. There was no celebration. Her mother was no longer alive. Her father was gone too. The people who had spent decades waiting would never see the arrest. That fact hung over the investigation. The killer had finally been identified. But the people who wanted the answer most had already died without hearing it. For the remaining family members, the arrest brought conflicting emotion, relief, anger, grief, and disbelief. How could someone lie for nearly 40 years with such a secret? How could a murder disappear into an ordinary life? How could one tiny piece of evidence survive while almost everyone connected to the case was gone? The answer was buried in the laboratory. The DNA had been there since 1987. It had simply been waiting for science to catch up. The case became a national story. Headlines appeared everywhere. Texas 1987 cold case solved. DNA match stuns investigator. Nearly 4 decades after a young woman disappeared on a lonely road, authorities had identified the man they believed responsible. But the most chilling part of the case was not the arrest. It was what happened afterward. Investigators returned to the original crime scene. The road looked different. New utility poles, new fences, new pavement. But the field remained. The cedar trees were still there. The place where Laura had been found had changed very little. A detective stood beneath the branches with the original photographs in his hand. The image showed the same tree, the same slope, the same stretch of grass. 39 years had passed. But the ground remembered. There was something haunting about that. The investigation had begun with a missing woman and a silent car. It ended with a genetic code. Between those two moments were thousands of hours of unanswered questions. Thousands of days in which Laura's family had wondered whether justice would ever arrive. Now it had. But justice did not erase the year. It did not return Laura. It did not restore her future. It did not give her family the decades they lost. It simply placed a name where there had once been a blank space. And sometimes that is what solving a cold case means, not rewriting history, just finally understanding who was responsible for destroying it. The prosecution prepared its case carefully. Defense attorneys challenged the DNA methodology. They questioned the genealogy process. They argued that genetic evidence could place a person near a crime but could not explain exactly what happened. Prosecutors responded with a complete chain of evidence. The DNA was not standing alone. It was connected to the timeline, connected to the location, connected to the vehicle, connected to historical witness information, connected to the circumstances surrounding Laura's disappearance. One piece was coincidence. 2 pieces were interesting. But dozens of pieces formed a pattern, and the pattern led back to Carter. The courtroom filled on the first major hearing. Laura's photograph was displayed. She was smiling, young, alive, unaware that her name would one day become synonymous with one of Texas's most persistent cold cases. Across the room sat Carter, older now, his face expressionless. For nearly 4 decades, he had lived with the freedom that came from an unsolved crime. Now that freedom was gone, the trial forced the past into the present. Witnesses were called. Old documents were introduced. Investigators described the original crime scene. Forensic specialists explained the DNA. The defense emphasized uncertainty. The prosecution emphasized probability. And at the center of everything was Laura, not the evidence, not the headlines, not the suspect. Laura, a 24-year-old woman who had left work one evening expecting to go home. She never made it. The jury heard how her family searched, how the case faded, how investigators kept the evidence, how technology eventually reopened a door that had been locked for decades. The courtroom became silent when the DNA evidence was explained. The numbers were almost incomprehensible. The biological material recovered from Laura's clothing had been preserved for nearly 40 years. It had survived storage. It had survived changes in personnel. It had survived changing technology. And eventually, it spoke. The jury returned its verdict after deliberation. Guilty. The word was small. The weight of it was enormous. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. The case was officially solved, but there was no triumph. Only a long exhale from a community that had carried the mystery for too many years. One of Laura's surviving relatives stood before the camera. She held a photograph. She did not speak about revenge. She spoke about Laura. She remembered her laugh, her stubbornness, her love of music, the little things, the ordinary things, the things that murder cannot erase. The case had been called a cold case for decades, but Laura had never been cold. She had remained alive in photographs, in memories, in old letters, in the stories her family continued telling. And now her name was no longer followed only by the words missing or murdered. There was another word, solved. Yet the story remained unsettling because of how close the answer had always been. The evidence had never vanished. It had been sitting in a box, waiting. The world had changed around it. Detectives had changed. Technology had changed. But the evidence remained exactly where it had been left. A silent witness. A microscopic witness. A witness that did not forget. That is what makes cold cases so haunting. Time does not necessarily destroy the truth. Sometimes time hides it. Sometimes the smallest detail survives everything. Sometimes a forgotten piece of clothing can outlive an entire generation. Sometimes a laboratory report written in 1987 can wait until 2026 to become the most important document in an investigation. And sometimes the person responsible for a crime believes the passage of time has erased the danger. It has not. The county road where Laura disappeared still exists. Cars still travel it at night. Headlights still move through the darkness. The fields still stretch toward the horizon. And when the sun goes down, the road becomes quiet again. For years, people drove past that place without knowing what happened there. Now they know. They know that a young woman once stopped there. They know that she never returned home. They know that someone took her life. And they know that nearly 4 decades later, science finally connected the past to the present. The case became a warning, not just to criminals, to investigators, to families, to everyone who believes an unanswered question will remain unanswered forever. Evidence has a way of waiting. DNA has no memory. It does not care about age. It does not care about distance. It does not care how many years have passed. It simply remains. A genetic signature hidden inside a microscopic trait. A silent message left behind by a moment of violence. For Laura Bennett, that message survived. For the investigators who reopened the file, it became the first real voice the case had heard in decades. And for the man sitting behind bars, it became the one witness he could not intimidate, contradict, or outrun. 39 years after a coffee cup tipped over inside an abandoned car, after a pair of shoes lay separated in the grass, After a family waited through birthdays and holidays and anniversaries without an answer, the mystery finally had a conclusion. Not because someone remembered, not because a witness suddenly came forward, not because the killer confessed, because something almost invisible had survived. The DNA match stunned investigators because it did more than identify a suspect. It collapsed time. For one instant, 1987 and the present existed together. A young woman stepped onto a dark Texas road. A man crossed her path. A crime occurred. A case went cold. Decades passed, and then a laboratory opened a file. The past returned. The silence broke. The name was revealed, and the cold case was no longer cold. The courtroom doors closed behind the last reporter, but outside, the questions continued. A guilty verdict had finally placed a name beside Laura Bennett's death, yet the case still contained gaps, refused to disappear. The DNA had established a connection. The old records had placed Carter near the area. The vehicle evidence had reopened forgotten details, but investigators knew that a conviction could never bring Laura back, and it could never restore the missing hours between the moment she left the convenience store and the moment her car was found abandoned beside the county road. Those hours remained trapped inside the darkness of October 1987. For the detectives who had spent years rebuilding the investigation, that missing timeline became an obsession. They went back through everything, not just the evidence that had survived, everything, every report, every interview, every handwritten note, every photograph, every discarded theory. The original case file contained hundreds of pages. Some were typed on aging paper. Others were handwritten in fading ink. Names appeared repeatedly. Some had been crossed out. Some were marked as cleared. Others had never been followed up. One name caught the attention of the new investigative team. It was not Michael Carter. It belonged to a man who had been questioned in the first week after Laura's disappearance. His name was Robert Hale. Hale had worked at a trucking company near the highway in 1987. He told investigators he had seen Laura's car around 7 in the evening. He claimed he noticed a dark pickup behind her. The original detective had written one sentence beneath the statement, unable to confirm. That was it. No second interview. No vehicle comparison. No follow-up. For 39 years, the statement sat almost forgotten. Now investigators wanted to know why. They located Hale. He was 78 years old. His memory was imperfect, but when detectives showed him a photograph of Laura's car, his expression changed. He stared at it for several seconds. Then he pointed toward the rear of the vehicle. "I remember that car," he said. The detectives leaned forward. Hale explained that he had been driving home that night when he saw Laura's sedan slowing near the intersection. A dark pickup had followed behind her for several hundred yards. At the time, he thought nothing of it. Then he remembered something else. The pickup had not continued down the highway. It had turned onto the county road, the same road where Laura's car would be found hours later. Detectives asked whether he could identify the driver. Hale shook his head. No, but he remembered the truck. Dark body, older model, damage near the rear light, and something else, a white object hanging from the mirror. The investigators already knew Carter had owned a dark pickup. They knew about the damaged taillight. Now they discovered an old photograph taken during Carter's employment at the construction company. In the photograph, hanging from his rearview mirror, was a small white religious medal. The discovery did not prove anything by itself, but the investigation was no longer searching for a single piece of evidence. It was assembling a pattern, and patterns are what cold cases fear most, because a single unanswered question can survive for decades. A pattern is much harder to bear. Investigators returned to the vehicle records. Laura's sedan had been examined in 1987. The forensic report listed several fingerprints that could not be identified. At the time, there was no database capable of providing an answer. Those prints were considered useless. Now, investigators wondered whether they could be re-examined. The problem was, A, the vehicle had been released to Laura's family after the investigation. Years later, it was sold. Eventually, it disappeared from official records. The fingerprints were gone. Another door closed. But the team kept moving. They examined Carter's employment history. In October 1987, he worked a rotating schedule. His employer had originally told investigators Carter finished his shift at 9 p.m. That detail had never been considered important, but the payroll records told a different story. Carter had clocked out at 6:41 p.m. The handwritten correction beside his name had been overlooked for decades. That meant Carter had been free during the exact period when Laura disappeared. Investigators searched for the supervisor who had made the correction. He was dead. They searched for co-workers. 2 had died. 1 had moved overseas. Another agreed to speak. The co-worker remembered Carter leaving early that night. He also remembered Carter being unusually agitated. He was in a hurry, the witness said. Why? Nobody knew. Carter had never explained it. The investigators now had another problem. They needed to determine whether Carter knew Laura. The answer appeared to be no. There were no phone records connecting them, no photographs, no social connection, no obvious relationship. But cold cases do not always begin with relationships. Sometimes they begin with opportunity. Laura was driving alone. Carter was nearby. The road was isolated. And someone had known exactly where to leave the car. Then investigators found something buried in an old property record. In 1987, Carter rented a small storage unit approximately 3 miles from the field where Laura's body was found. The unit existed for only 4 months, October through January. After Laura's murder, Carter emptied it. The storage company no longer existed. The building had been demolished. There was no physical evidence left, but the rental agreement remained. One line contained Carter's signature. Another contained his vehicle information. The same dark pickup. The same license plate. The same man. The discovery changed the way investigators viewed the case. They began examining whether the storage unit had been used to conceal evidence. They found nothing. No weapon. No clothing. No photographs. No trace of Laura. Nothing. And yet the location itself was disturbing. 3 miles. That was all. 3 miles between the storage unit and the field. 3 miles between the road and the place where Laura was found. The investigation became a reconstruction of distance. Detectives drove the route. They timed it. At night. In darkness. Without traffic. The drive from the storage facility to the crime scene took less than 7 minutes. From Laura's last confirmed location to the county road took less than 15. The timeline fit too well. But the case still depended on the DNA. Without it, the rest might have remained coincidence. With it, every coincidence became something else. Investigators contacted the original forensic examiner. She was retired. When shown the modern DNA report, she became emotional. She remembered Laura. She remembered the clothing. She remembered the uncertainty. In 1987, the sample could only be described as biological material. There was no way to turn it into a name. Now there was. She told investigators she had always believed the evidence mattered. She simply never imagined she would live long enough to see it identify someone. That statement stayed with the detective because it explained what a cold case really was. It was not an empty file. It was unfinished work. Every cold case contains pieces waiting for someone to notice them again. A fingerprint, a fiber, a photograph, a forgotten witness, a laboratory sample, a sentence written in the margin of an old report. Sometimes the difference between failure and a breakthrough is not new evidence. It is a new pair of eyes. And Laura's case finally had that. The detectives interviewed Carter again. This time, they did not tell him about the DNA match immediately. They asked about 1987. They asked where he worked, where he drove, who he knew, what he remembered. Carter answered calmly. He claimed his memory was poor. He said 40 years was too long. He could not remember the exact night. He could not remember Laura. He could not remember the county road. But when detectives mentioned the dark pickup, Carter stopped speaking. It lasted only a few seconds. Then he asked a question. "Why are you asking me about that truck?" The room became silent. The investigators did not answer. Carter looked down at the table. Then he said the truck had been sold years ago. That was true. But the question mattered, because detectives had never told him the truck was important. They had only asked about vehicles he owned in 1987. Carter had volunteered the detail. The interview ended shortly afterward. The detectives left without a confession, but they had something more important. They had watched him react. They compared his answers with the old records. Several details did not match. He claimed he had spent the entire evening at home. Payroll records placed him at work until 6:41. He claimed he never drove the county road. A former co-worker remembered him taking that route regularly. He claimed he never knew Laura. The DNA evidence suggested otherwise. The defense would later argue that biological material could have been transferred, but prosecutors would point to the totality of the evidence. The sample had not appeared in isolation. It had been recovered from Laura's clothing. It had survived decades. It matched Carter, and Carter's movements placed him in the same geographic area during the critical period. Then came the detail that changed everything. Investigators discovered that Carter had visited the same convenience store where Laura had purchased coffee. Not once, several times. The store's owner had kept old employee notes because of a tax dispute. One note listed Carter as a regular customer. The owner remembered him. He remembered Laura too, but nobody had ever connected them. Until now. The owner said Carter sometimes arrived around the same time Laura did. He could not say they knew each other. He could not say they had spoken, but he remembered seeing them in the same place. That meant the encounter investigators had once considered impossible was suddenly plausible. Laura may not have known Carter personally, but Carter may have known her routine. He may have seen her before. He may have noticed what time she left work. He may have noticed which road she took. And if he had followed her that night, he would have known exactly where the road became isolated. The question that haunted investigators now was simple. Had Carter chosen Laura? Or had he simply encountered an opportunity? Nobody could answer. Carter never confessed. He maintained his innocence. But the evidence continued to tighten around him. The county road, the dark pickup, the damaged taillight, the early departure from work, the storage unit, the DNA, the forgotten witness, the convenience store. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were converging. And somewhere beneath all those years of silence was the final sequence of events. Laura leaves the store. Her headlights disappear down the road. A dark pickup follows. The road becomes empty. The coffee sits untouched in the passenger seat. The driver's door opens. A shoe falls into the grass. Then another. The headlights remain on. And somewhere beyond the road, beneath the cedar trees, Laura's life ends. For decades, nobody knew what happened next. Now investigators believed they finally understood, but one question remained. Why had Carter believed he could get away with it? The answer may have been hidden in the year itself. 1987 was a different world. No smartphones, no digital surveillance, no GPS, no modern DNA databases, no cameras covering every parking lot. A person could disappear down a rural road and leave behind almost nothing. Carter may have believed the night would erase him. He may have believed the darkness was enough. He was wrong, because the smallest trace remained. And nearly 40 years later, that trace became a name that led investigators back to a man who had spent decades living as though Laura Bennett had never existed. But Laura had existed. Her family had remembered. The evidence had remembered. And eventually the law remembered too. The cold case had waited almost for decades. The killer had waited too. He simply did not know that the waiting was never over. The night after Carter's arrest, investigators returned to the evidence room and placed Laura Bennett's original case box on the table. The cardboard was worn. The corners were soft from years of handling. A faded label still carried the date. October 1987. For almost 40 years, that box had represented failure. An unsolved murder, a family without answers, a file that had grown older while the person responsible grew older with it. Now, the box looked different. Not like an ending, like a door that had finally opened. Detective Martin Shaw removed the first report from the folder, then another, then another. He began comparing the old notes with the new evidence. Within minutes, he noticed something that had never made sense. The original investigators had recorded that Laura's purse was found approximately 12 feet from her body, but the crime scene photographs showed something different. The purse appeared closer to the tree line. The difference was small, only a few feet. But in a murder investigation, a few feet can change everything. Shaw enlarged the photographs. He studied the grass, the branches, the position of Laura's shoe. Then he noticed a faint disturbance leading away from the body. It had never been mentioned in the original report. The photographs showed flattened vegetation extending toward a shallow depression in the ground. Investigators searched the area again. They found nothing, but they discovered that the depression led toward an old drainage ditch that had been filled decades earlier. A construction map showed that the ditch had been covered in 1991. That meant something important. The original crime scene had changed. Evidence that might once have been visible was now buried beneath layers of soil. Investigators contacted the county. The drainage records revealed that during the 1987 investigation, the ditch had been partially flooded. Heavy rain had fallen 2 days before Laura's body was found. That explained why investigators had never followed the disturbance far. The water had destroyed the tracks. It also meant the killer had chosen a location where weather could erase evidence. Or perhaps he had simply been lucky. Investigators could not know. They returned to Carter's history. In 1987, he had worked construction. His job required him to understand drainage systems, rural roads, and access points around the county. He knew where vehicles could disappear from sight. He knew which roads were rarely patrolled. He knew which fields were empty at night. That did not prove he planned Laura's murder, but it made the location less mysterious. Someone had chosen the field carefully, and Carter knew the area. The investigation moved deeper into his personal history. Detectives interviewed former co-workers. Most remembered him as quiet. Some described him as impatient. One remembered something more disturbing. Carter had once joked that rural roads were the easiest places to make somebody disappear. The co-worker had laughed when he heard it in 1987. He assumed it was nothing. Decades later, the memory felt different. Investigators asked why he remembered the comment. The co-worker said Carter had made it after hearing about another woman who had disappeared in a neighboring county. At the time, nobody connected it to Laura. Now detectives wondered whether it had been more than a joke. They searched local records for other unsolved disappearances. There were several. Most had nothing to do with Carter. One, however, caught their attention. A 17-year-old girl had disappeared in 1985 after leaving a shopping center. Her body had never been found. The case remained unsolved. Investigators compared the locations. They were nearly 30 miles apart. No direct connection. No DNA evidence. No known link to Carter. The possibility was unsettling, but prosecutors warned detectives not to expand the case without evidence. Laura's murder was already strong. They did not need another mystery. They needed certainty. So they returned to the night of October 1987. One question dominated everything. How did Laura end up in the field? The physical evidence suggested she had not willingly walked there. Her shoes were separated. Her clothing was torn. The grass showed signs of struggle, but there was no obvious blood trail from the car to the body. That suggested the attack may have occurred quickly. Perhaps inside the vehicle. Perhaps beside it. Perhaps Laura had been threatened before she understood what was happening. The passenger window was open. That detail returned again and again. Why? One possibility was that someone had been standing outside the passenger door. Another was that Laura had lowered the window because someone approached her. A third possibility was that the killer had entered through the passenger side. Investigators could never know, but they could examine the evidence for what it ruled out. Robbery appeared unlikely. Laura still had her money. Her jewelry remained. Her purse had not been emptied. The motive was not obvious. There was no ransom. No sexual communication had been documented. No known personal conflict. The murder looked random. That possibility terrified the community, because a random killer does not need a reason, only an opportunity. For Laura's family, that uncertainty was devastating. Her younger brother Daniel had been 12 when she died. He grew up with the case. At first, he believed the killer would be caught quickly. Then months passed. Then years. Eventually, the case became part of his identity. He kept Laura's photograph. He kept the last birthday card she had given him. He remembered her handwriting. He remembered her voice. He remembered the night their mother told him she was dead. For years, he avoided interviews. After Carter's arrest, he agreed to speak. He told investigators that the hardest part had never been the murder itself. It was the silence. The silence after the funeral. The silence from investigators. The silence from strangers who eventually stopped asking. He said people assumed the family had moved on. They had not. They had simply learned how to carry the unanswered question. When he heard about the DNA match, he sat alone in his kitchen. He read the message several times. He could not believe it. Then he looked at Laura's photograph. For the first time in nearly 40 years, he said he felt that someone had finally heard them. But he still wanted one thing: the truth. Not just a conviction. Not just a name. He wanted to know what happened to his sister during those missing hours. Investigators wanted the same answer. That was why they kept digging. The DNA could identify Carter. It could not tell them what he had done. So forensic specialists examined the biological evidence again. They looked for additional traces. They found a second DNA profile. It was partial, too degraded to identify. But it was not Laura's. The discovery created a new question. Was there another person involved? The laboratory could not answer. The profile might have belonged to someone who had innocently touched Laura's clothing before the murder. It might have come from a family member. It might have been contamination. Or it might have belonged to another person at the scene. Investigators tested known relatives. The second profile did not match them. They tested available evidence from the original crime scene. Still no match. The mystery deepened. Then forensic analysts discovered something crucial. The unidentified profile was extremely weak. It contained only a handful of usable genetic markers. It was not strong enough for a database search, but it could potentially be used for comparison. Investigators wondered whether Carter could have had an accomplice. They examined his known associates from 1987. One name appeared repeatedly: Thomas Reed. Reed had worked with Carter at the construction company. He owned a dark pickup. He had also been near the county road that night. For a brief moment, detectives believed they had found the missing piece. Then the records were checked. Reed had been hospitalized that evening. He had suffered a severe injury at work. Doctors documented his arrival at 8:14 p.m. He could not have been with Carter during the critical period. Another theory collapsed. The second DNA profile remained unexplained, but the investigators did not abandon it. They knew degraded evidence could produce strange results. The profile might never be identified. That did not weaken the primary case. If anything, it reinforced the need for caution. Cold cases are dangerous because investigators can become desperate for a conclusion. The new team refused to make that mistake. They wanted fact. They wanted evidence that could survive court, and they wanted Laura's story to remain at the center. Carter's defense attorneys attacked the genealogy evidence. They argued that a distant familial connection could lead investigators toward innocent people. That was true. Genetic genealogy could narrow a search. It could not replace direct evidence. But prosecutors had direct evidence. The DNA from Laura's clothing matched Carter. That was different. The genealogy had only opened the door. The forensic comparison had walked through it. The defense then raised another issue. The sample had been stored for nearly 40 years. Could degradation have affected the result? Forensic scientists explained that DNA can remain usable for decades when properly preserved. The sample had been carefully stored. The chain of custody was documented. Every transfer had been recorded. Every laboratory procedure had been logged. The defense could challenge interpretation, but they could not erase the evidence. The old crime scene photographs became critical. One showed a small tear in Laura's blouse. Another showed the exact area where the biological material had been recovered. The photographs were grainy. The lighting was poor, but the evidence was there. A tiny sample. A tiny piece of the past. A tiny piece that had survived longer than anyone expected. Meanwhile, investigators searched for Carter's whereabouts immediately after the murder. His employment records showed he did not return to work until the next afternoon. His supervisor remembered him arriving late. Carter claimed he had spent the morning sleeping, but a neighbor remembered seeing him washing his truck before sunrise. At first, that seemed insignificant. Then detectives discovered the original vehicle description. The witness had reported that the dark pickup appeared unusually clean. If Carter had washed the truck that morning, there was no proof he was removing evidence. It could have been ordinary maintenance. But investigators found something else. The truck had been cleaned shortly after the murder. The passenger seat had been removed. The reason Carter gave was that he was repairing the floor. The mechanic who performed the work remembered the truck. He said there had been a dark stain beneath the passenger seat. He assumed it was grease. He had no reason to think otherwise. The mechanic had died years earlier. The truck was gone. The stain was gone. Only the memory remained. That was the cruelty of the case. So much evidence had existed, and so much had disappeared before anyone knew what it meant. Yet enough remained. Enough to build a case. Enough to bring Carter into court. Enough to finally force the past into the light. The detectives understood something now. They would never reconstruct every second of that night. No investigation could. Too much time had passed. Too many witnesses were gone. Too much physical evidence had been lost. But they did not need every second. They needed enough truth to establish responsibility. And the evidence was beginning to speak with one voice. Carter was near Laura. Carter had access to the road. Carter's vehicle fit the description. Carter's timeline was inconsistent. Carter had connections to the area, and Carter's DNA was found on evidence directly connected to Laura. The cold case was no longer a mystery without direction. It had become a confrontation between memory and evidence. And as investigators prepared for the next stage, one final question remained hanging over everything. What had happened inside that car before Laura opened the door? Because somewhere inside that vehicle was the moment the case changed forever. The coffee had spilled. The headlights had stayed on. The door had opened. And Laura had stepped into the darkness. Nobody saw exactly what happened next. For 39 years, that darkness belonged to the killer. Now, investigators were determined to take it back. The answer to what happened inside Laura Bennett's car had always been hidden behind one impossible fact. Nobody had seen it. Nobody had heard it. The road was too isolated. The nearest house was too far away. The darkness had swallowed the scene before anyone understood that a crime was taking place. But decades later, investigators discovered that the absence of witnesses did not mean the night had left no record. The car itself had left one. When the original vehicle photographs were reviewed with modern forensic software, detectives noticed a detail that had been overlooked in 1987. The passenger side door appeared to have been opened at some point before the vehicle was abandoned. There were faint marks along the interior trim. At the time, they had been dismissed as ordinary wear. Now, investigators looked again. The marks were concentrated around the door handle. Not enough to establish exactly what happened. Enough to establish that someone had interacted with that door. Laura's purse had been found near the front passenger seat. Her coffee had spilled across the upholstery. One of her shoes had been discovered outside the vehicle. The scene suggested movement. But whose movement? That question became central. Investigators recreated the interior of a similar model car. They placed the driver's seat where Laura normally kept it. Then they adjusted it to the position recorded in the original photographs. The difference was striking. The seat had been moved backward. A taller person could have driven the vehicle comfortably. Laura could have driven it that way too. But according to her family, she was meticulous about the position of her seat. She was short. She always pulled the seat forward. That detail had never seemed important. Now it mattered. The investigators compared the seat position with Carter's height. He was 6 feet tall. The seating position was consistent with someone his size. Again, it was not proof. But the pattern continued. Then came the steering wheel. A faint smear had been photographed near the lower edge. The original laboratory had labeled it unidentified residue. There was no technology in 1987 capable of extracting a usable genetic profile from such a tiny trace. The sample had been discarded. Another piece of the puzzle was gone, but there was still enough. The detectives returned to the roadside. They measured the distance between the vehicle and the location where Laura had been found, approximately 160 feet. A person could walk it in less than a minute, but the grass showed signs that Laura had struggled. Her blouse had torn. Her shoe had come loose. There were broken branches. The original investigators had concluded that she had been dragged or forced toward the tree. Modern investigators reached the same conclusion, but they added something new: the direction of movement. Laura appeared to have moved away from the road toward the tree line. The person responsible had not simply killed her at the roadside and left. He had taken her farther into the field. That suggested planning or fear of being seen. Either way, the killer had wanted distance. The county road was isolated, but a passing driver could still appear. The trees offered concealment. Carter knew that. His construction work had taken him through the area. He knew the terrain. He knew where the road narrowed. He knew where the fields disappeared into darkness. The location was no longer random, at least not from the investigators' perspective. Then detectives found an old map. The map had been stored inside Carter's employment file. It showed several rural routes used by construction crews. One route passed directly behind the field where Laura was found. The route had no streetlights, no homes, no businesses, just a narrow access road. Investigators marked it. The same road could have allowed Carter to enter and leave the area without using the main highway. That meant he could have approached the scene It also explained why no witness had reported seeing his truck. The investigation was beginning to reconstruct an invisible route, a route that existed for only a few minutes on one night in 1987. But the route was not the only thing that emerged. A former construction employee named Alan Pierce remembered Carter talking about Laura's disappearance the morning after the body was found. Pierce had never reported it. He had assumed the conversation was ordinary, but when detectives interviewed him decades later, he remembered Carter saying something unusual. He said they would never find who did it. Detectives asked whether Carter had used Laura's name. Pierce said no. At the time, the victim's identity was already known, but the phrasing bothered him. Why was Carter talking about whether the killer would be found? Pierce could not explain. He had never considered Carter suspicious. Not then. Not for decades. Only after detectives showed him the photograph of Carter did the old memory return. The human mind is strange. It forgets details until something gives those details meaning. For Pierce, the photograph unlocked a sentence buried for nearly 40 years. For investigators, it added another piece. Carter had known about the murder almost immediately. That was not suspicious by itself. The murder was local news. Everyone knew. But Carter's reaction was different. According to Pierce, Carter seemed certain, not worried, not surprised, certain. He had said the killer would never be found, and now, decades later, investigators wondered whether he had known because he was the killer. The defense dismissed the statement as unreliable. A memory recalled after almost 40 years could not be trusted completely. The prosecution agreed that memory was imperfect. That was why they did not build the case around it. They built it around evidence. The DNA remained the center, but the historical statements helped explain the circumstances surrounding it. Carter's behavior after the murder, his movements, his vehicle, his proximity, the abandoned car, the biological evidence. The pattern was becoming harder to dismiss. Then investigators discovered a second old witness. A woman named Evelyn Harper had lived near the county road in 1987. She had never been interviewed. Her house had been outside the original search area. She was 90 years old when detectives finally located her. Her memory was fragile, but one detail remained sharp. On the night Laura disappeared, Evelyn heard a vehicle stop near her property. She looked through her window. She saw headlights. Then she saw a man standing beside a car. She could not see his face, but she remembered the sound of a woman's voice. She heard someone say, "Please," only once. Then the vehicle moved. Evelyn had not called police because she believed it was an argument between people who knew each other. She had no idea someone was being murdered. That single word became one of the most haunting details in the reopened case. Please. A tiny fragment of sound preserved only in memory. No recording, no physical evidence. Just a 90-year-old woman remembering a voice from nearly 4 decades earlier. Investigators did not treat it as definitive. They treated it as context. But for Laura's brother Daniel, hearing the story was devastating. For the first time, he imagined his sister's final moments. He wished he had never heard it. Then he said he was glad someone remembered. That contradiction followed the family through the entire investigation. Every answer brought another wound. The family wanted truth, but truth was painful. The cold case had been easier when it was an empty space. Now the empty space was filling with detail. Some were unbearable. Some were uncertain. Some could never be proven. But all of them pointed toward one terrible possibility. Laura knew she was in danger, and she had tried to escape. Investigators examined the shoe evidence again. One shoe had remained near the car. The other had been found closer to the tree. The distance between them suggested rapid movement. Laura may have run. She may have been pulled. She may have fought. The evidence could not distinguish between those possibilities, but it did show movement. And movement meant resistance. The case was no longer simply about where Laura was found. It was about what happened between the car and the tree, a space of roughly 160 feet, a distance that had taken less than a minute that had become the longest mystery of Laura's life. The detectives recreated the route again. One walked from the car. Another followed behind. They counted the seconds. 30, 40, 50. At 60 seconds, they reached the tree. 1 minute. That was all. 1 minute in which Laura could have screamed. 1 minute in which someone could have heard. 1 minute in which the killer could have changed the course of an entire family. Then the detectives stood beneath the tree. The road was barely visible. The sound of passing vehicles was distant. The field was darker than they expected. They understood why nobody had seen anything. The location had been chosen by circumstance or by design. Either way, it had protected the killer for decades. But the killer had made one mistake. He had left biological evidence behind, and he could not erase it. The laboratory results became even more important when analysts confirmed that the DNA profile was not a statistical anomaly. The match was strong, extremely strong. The evidence connected Carter to Laura's clothing. The defense could argue about transfer. It could argue about contamination. It could argue about interpretation. But the investigators knew where the evidence had been recovered. They knew how it had been preserved. They knew the chain of custody. They knew the laboratory procedure. And they knew Carter's genetic profile matched. The technology that did not exist in 1987 had now reached backward through time. It had found him. The case file began to change. The old label unknown was replaced. A name appeared. Michael Ray Carter. For the first time, Laura's family could point to someone. Not a shadow. Not a theory. Not a rumor. A person. A living man. The arrest had shocked the community. But the DNA confirmation shocked investigators even more because the original case had been so close. The evidence had been sitting there all along. The mystery had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting for a technology capable of reading it. The investigators realized that the most important lesson was not that Carter had been found. It was that Laura had never truly been forgotten. Her clothing had been preserved. Her photographs had survived. Her family's memories had survived. Her case file had survived. And one microscopic trace had survived. Everything else had changed. The killer had aged. The detectives had retired. The witnesses had grown old. The county had transformed. But the evidence had remained. Silent. Patient. Waiting. And now the silence was breaking. Carter was facing the weight of a crime committed nearly 40 years earlier. The prosecution had a case. The family had an answer. The community had a name. But one final piece remained unresolved. The motive. Why Laura? Why that night? Why that road? Why her? Investigators searched again. They reviewed every known interaction between Carter and Laura. They found no romantic relationship, no business dispute, no financial connection, no documented conflict, nothing. The lack of motive made the case even more disturbing, because sometimes there is no satisfying explanation. Sometimes the answer is not hidden behind a secret relationship. Sometimes there is no grand conspiracy. Sometimes a person simply encounters another person at the wrong moment. A lonely road, a vulnerable target, a decision made in seconds, and a life destroyed. That possibility haunted Daniel more than anything. He wanted to know why. The investigators could give him a name. They could give him evidence. They could give him a verdict. But they might never give him a reason. And that was the cruelest part of the truth. Some questions survive even after a cold case is solved. The identity of the killer can become known. The evidence can become overwhelming. The courtroom can deliver its verdict. Yet the final mystery can remain. Why? Why Laura? Why that night? Why did a young woman leave work and never come home? The road could not answer. The field could not answer. The trees could not answer. Only the person responsible knew, and he continued to refuse to speak. But the investigation had already taken something from him. His anonymity, his freedom, his ability to pretend the past was gone. The cold case had finally reached him, and the evidence that survived the darkness was now sitting in a courtroom waiting to tell the story he had spent nearly 40 years refusing to tell. The prosecution did not need Michael Carter to confess. That became clear as the case moved toward trial. His silence could not erase the evidence. His denials could not change the old photographs. His memory could not rewrite payroll records from 1987, and no explanation he offered could make the DNA disappear. But investigators still wanted to understand the final hours of Laura Bennett's life because identifying the man responsible was only one part of solving a murder that had haunted a Texas community for nearly 4 decades. The courtroom became a place where old evidence was forced to speak. The first witness described Laura's final evening. She had left work shortly after 6. She was carrying her purse. She was wearing the clothes later photographed at the crime scene. She had plans to go home. Nothing about her behavior suggested she expected danger. Then the convenience store attendant testified. He remembered the coffee. He remembered Laura asking about the road. He remembered the dark pickup that had been parked farther down the lot. At the time, he had not connected it to anything. Now he understood why detectives had returned to his store decades later. The defense questioned his memory. Nearly 40 years had passed. The attendant admitted he could not remember the driver's fate, but he remembered the truck, and he remembered seeing it leave shortly after Laura. The prosecution did not ask him to identify Carter. They did not need to. They only needed the jury to understand the timeline. Laura left. The truck followed. The road became empty. Then Laura vanished. The next witness was one of the most important, Robert Hale, the truck driver who had originally reported seeing a dark pickup behind Laura's car. Hale entered the courtroom slowly. He was nearly 80. His hands trembled. He had carried that memory for decades without understanding its significance. When the prosecution showed him the original photograph of Laura's vehicle, he stared at it for a long time. Then he said he remembered the car. The prosecutor asked him what he remembered about the vehicle behind it. Hale described the pickup. Dark, older, damaged rear light. The defense attorney immediately challenged him. How could he remember details from one brief sighting nearly 40 years earlier? Hale answered simply, "Because I knew later that someone died." The courtroom went quiet. He explained that after learning about Laura's murder, the memory had stayed with him. He remembered wondering whether the vehicle he saw had mattered. He remembered telling investigators. He remembered being told there was not enough information. Then the case went cold. Hale never forgot. He just stopped believing anyone would ask him again. The prosecutor asked whether he could identify Carter as the driver. Hale said no. He never claimed he could. That honesty strengthened his testimony. He was not trying to solve the case. He was describing what he remembered. The defense could challenge the accuracy, but they could not erase the fact that the old statement existed. The statement had been written in 1987, before Carter was ever identified, before DNA connected him to Laura. That mattered. It meant the detail about the truck was not invented after the arrest. It had been recorded decades earlier. The next witness was the former construction coworker. He described Carter leaving work early. He remembered Carter being restless. He remembered the dark pickup. He remembered Carter talking about the murder the following morning. Then came the sentence that had survived almost 40 years. They'll never find who did it. The defense attacked the testimony. The witness admitted that memory could change. He admitted he had not thought about the conversation for decades, but the prosecutor asked one question. Did you tell investigators this in 1987? The witness said no. Why not? Because I didn't think it mattered. That answer exposed the tragedy of the entire case. So many details had existed. People had seen things. People had heard things. People had noticed things. But nobody understood their meaning. A dark truck was just a dark truck. A man leaving work early was just a man leaving work early. A strange comment was just a strange comment. A piece of biological evidence was just an unidentified sample. The pieces existed. The picture did not. Until decades later. Then the forensic specialist took the stand. The courtroom became intensely quiet. She explained the DNA process. The original sample had been preserved. Modern testing extracted a usable profile. That profile was compared against Carter's DNA. The match was extraordinarily strong. The defense asked whether DNA could be transferred. The specialist agreed that secondary transfer was possible under certain circumstances. Then the prosecutor asked whether the evidence showed signs of accidental transfer. The specialist explained that the location and context of the biological material made the finding significant. The DNA did not exist in a random environment. It was associated with Laura's clothing. The evidence had been collected from a crime scene. The profile belonged to Carter, and Carter had no innocent explanation for why his DNA would be there. The defense offered one. They suggested that the biological material might have been transferred through another person. The prosecution responded by presenting the timeline. Carter had been near the area. His vehicle matched the description. His schedule placed him there. The witness statement supported the route. The DNA connected him to Laura. The argument was no longer about one piece of evidence. It was about all of them. The prosecutor placed a photograph of Laura on a large screen. The image showed her smiling. The room became still. Then came the sentence that had defined the case for decades. She was 24 years old when she died. Not 24 forever. 24. When she died. She never became 25. She never grew older. She never married. She never had the future her family imagined. The courtroom was reminded that the defendant had lived through all those years. Laura had not. That contrast became one of the most powerful elements of the prosecution's case. Carter had lived. He had worked. He had moved. He had aged. He had watched seasons change. He had attended weddings and funerals. He had experienced 40 years of ordinary life. Laura's life ended on one dark road. The defense asked the jury to focus on reasonable doubt. The prosecution asked them to focus on the evidence. The decision would depend on which story they believed. The defense story was simple. The evidence was old. Memories were unreliable. The DNA could have another explanation. There was no eyewitness who could identify Carter. There was no murder weapon. There was no confession. There was no video. The prosecution's story was also simple. Carter's DNA was connected to Laura. His movements fit the timeline. His vehicle matched the witness description. His statements contained inconsistency, and the historical evidence existed long before investigators ever suspected him. The jury had to decide whether those pieces formed a coherent picture. While the lawyers argued, Daniel Bennett sat in the gallery. He listened to every word. He had spent most of his life imagining what this moment would feel like. He expected anger. He expected satisfaction. Instead, he felt exhausted. The trial could explain the evidence. It could establish responsibility, but it could not explain the emptiness Laura had left behind. He looked at the photograph. For a moment, the courtroom disappeared. He was 12 again. His sister was alive. The family was together. The future had not yet been stolen. Then the judge's voice brought him back. The trial continued. The forensic investigator described the original crime scene. She explained where Laura's shoes had been found. where the blouse had torn, where the body had been located, where the car had been abandoned. Then she showed the jury the original photograph. The images were old, grainy, faded, but the scene was unmistakable. The dark car, the open door, the field, the trees, the shoes, the silence. The prosecution argued that the physical evidence demonstrated a struggle. The defense argued that the scene had been contaminated over time. The judge allowed the testimony. Then came the vehicle evidence. Investigators explained the driver's seat position, the passenger window, the abandoned key, the condition of the truck associated with Carter, the damaged rear light, the old mechanic's recollection, the morning vehicle cleaning. Each piece was imperfect, but together they created a troubling picture. The defense tried to separate them. The prosecution kept reconnecting them. That became the central battle. Could dozens of small coincidences really be coincidence? The jury had to decide. Then prosecutors introduced the genetic genealogy investigation. They explained that the initial DNA profile had not directly identified Carter. It had led investigators toward a family connection. From there, detectives had reconstructed a family tree. They had narrowed the possibility. Then they obtained Carter's discarded DNA legally. The laboratory comparison produced the match. The process was careful, documented, repeatable. The defense argued that genealogy could produce false leads. The prosecutor agreed. But this was no longer a genealogical lead. This was a direct forensic comparison. That distinction mattered. The courtroom seemed to understand it. The cold case had not been solved by guessing. It had been solved by evidence. And that evidence had survived for almost 4 decades. During closing arguments, the prosecutor walked slowly toward the jury. He held a copy of the original 1987 evidence report. He held the modern DNA report, 2 documents, separated by 39 years. He placed them beside each other. Then he said that the case had waited because technology had not been ready. The truth had been there. The science had not. Now both had arrived at the same conclusion. The defense argued that uncertainty remained. And technically it did. No case could recreate every moment. No witness could tell the entire story. But the jury was not asked to reconstruct every second. They were asked to decide whether the evidence established Carter's responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. The deliberation began. The family waited. The investigators waited. Reporters waited outside. Carter sat quietly. The courthouse clock continued moving. Minutes became hours. The old cold case had reached its final moment. For Daniel, the wait felt familiar. He had been waiting since childhood, waiting for a phone call, waiting for an arrest, waiting for a name, waiting for justice. Now he was waiting again. The jury returned. Everyone stood. The foreperson handed the verdict to the judge. The judge read, "Guilty." The word echoed through the courtroom. Daniel closed his eyes. He did not celebrate. He simply breathed. For nearly 40 years, the question had been whether anyone would ever be held responsible. Now the answer was yes. Carter was sentenced. The courtroom emptied. Outside, reporters gathered. The headlines spread across the country. Texas 1987, cold case solved. DNA match stuns investigator. Nearly 4 decades after Laura Bennett's murder, the mystery had finally ended. But Daniel refused to call it an end. He called it an answer. There was a difference. An ending suggested that everything was finished. An answer meant that one question had finally been resolved. Laura was still gone. Her family still carried the loss. The years could not be recovered. But the uncertainty was gone. That mattered. For the investigators, the case became an example of what could happen when old evidence was preserved. The biological sample had survived. The original reports had survived. The photographs had survived. Even memories had survived. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to rebuild a story that had nearly disappeared. The case also exposed the cruel mathematics of time. 39 years had passed. Some witnesses were dead. Some records were destroyed. Some evidence had vanished. Some investigators had never lived long enough to see the arrest. The detective who first opened Laura's file in 1987 had died before the DNA match. He would never know. That fact affected the new team deep. They knew they had completed work begun by people who were no longer here. Cold cases are often like that. One generation starts the investigation, another carries it. A third finally sees the answer. The detective who reopened Laura's file kept one photograph on his desk. It was the original picture of the abandoned car. He said it reminded him of something important. The case had never been empty. The evidence had been there. The problem was that nobody knew how to make it speak. Now it had spoken. And what it said had changed everything. The road where Laura disappeared remained quiet. Cars still passed. The field still stretched toward the horizon. The trees still stood where her body had been found. But the meaning of the place had changed. It was no longer only the scene of an unsolved murder. It was the place where a cold case began, and the place where time almost won. Almost. Because the killer made one mistake. He left something behind. Something smaller than a fingerprint. Something invisible to the naked eye. Something he probably never thought about again. DNA. 39 years later, that tiny trace became louder than every denial. It crossed decades. It crossed technology. It crossed the distance between the past and the present. And it brought Laura Bennett's killer back into the light. The road had kept its silence. The trees had kept their silence. The witnesses had forgotten. The records had faded. But the evidence remembered. And after 39 years, that was enough. The verdict did not end the questions. It changed them. For nearly 4 decades, investigators had asked, who killed Laura Bennett? Now they knew the name. The harder question was what happened during the final hours of her life and whether anything else had been missed. That question kept Detective Martin Shaw awake. The case had been solved legally, but Shaw wanted the truth to be as complete as the evidence allowed. He returned to the old timeline. 6:08 p.m. Laura leaves work. 7:02 p.m. She stops at the convenience store. Shortly afterward, her car leaves the parking lot. A dark pickup follows. 6:41 p.m. Carter's employment records show that he had already left work. Then nothing. No confirmed sighting. No phone call. No witness. Just darkness. And sometime during that darkness, Laura disappeared. Shaw spread the original documents across his desk, one page at a time. He was searching for something that investigators often miss in old cases. Not evidence. Contradictions. The first contradiction appeared in Carter's original statement. He had told investigators in 1987 that he did not know Laura. That remained consistent with his later interview. But he had also said something else. He claimed he had not heard about the murder until the following afternoon. That statement had seemed believable at the time. The case had not yet received widespread media coverage when Laura's body was discovered. But now investigators knew that Carter had discussed the murder with co-workers that same morning. That meant his 1987 statement was false. The question was why? Was he simply lying to protect himself from suspicion? Or had he known more than he admitted? Shaw examined the original interview note. The detective who questioned Carter had written a short observation in the margin. Subject appears nervous when vehicle discussed. That sentence had never triggered a follow-up. In 1987, there was no reason to focus on it. Now it looked different. The detective was dead. His handwritten notes were the only surviving record of his impression. Shaw stared at the sentence for several minutes. Then he placed a copy beside Carter's modern interview. The same pattern appeared. When investigators mentioned Laura's car, Carter became defensive. When they mentioned the road, he became quiet. When they mentioned the pickup, he asked how much they knew. Behavior could not prove guilt, but it could reveal fear. The team moved deeper into Carter's history. They discovered that after Laura's murder, he abruptly changed jobs. He left the construction company within 3 months. He moved to another town, then another. He married, had children, built a career. There was nothing extraordinary about the move. People move. People change jobs. People start families. But one detail stood out. Every move took him farther from the county. Not hundreds of miles, just far enough. Enough to put distance between himself and the place where Laura had died. The investigators could not prove that was intentional, but they could see the pattern. Then they found an old letter. It had been written by Carter to a friend shortly after he left Texas. The letter contained a sentence that investigators found disturbing. "I need to get away from this place." There was no mention of Laura, no mention of murder, nothing explicitly criminal. It could have meant anything: work, family, money, personal problems. But the timing made investigators uncomfortable. He had left shortly after Laura's murder, and he had never returned permanently. The case file grew thicker. The evidence became more complicated. But there was one thing investigators could not recover: Laura's final words. Nobody knew them. Nobody knew whether she recognized Carter. Nobody knew whether she fought him. Nobody knew whether she begged him to stop. The only surviving clue was Evelyn Harper's memory. One word: please. Daniel Bennett eventually heard the recording of Evelyn's interview. There was no audio from 1987, only the modern interview. He listened to the elderly woman's struggle to remember. He heard her describe the headlights, the vehicle, the distant voice. Then that word: please. Daniel turned the recording off. He sat in silence. For decades, he had imagined Laura's final moments without knowing anything. Now he knew one thing: she had been afraid. That knowledge hurt, but it also made her more real. She was not simply a photograph, not a name in a case file. She had been alive in that moment. She had understood danger. She had tried to survive. That changed the way Daniel thought about the case. He no longer wanted only justice. He wanted Laura's courage remembered. The investigation continued. Forensic specialists examined the old clothing one more time. They searched for microscopic traces that might still provide information. Most of the material had degraded, but one fiber remained. It was synthetic, dark blue, consistent with material used in work jackets during the 1980s. Carter had owned several work jackets, but millions of people did. The fiber could not identify him. Still, it supported the possibility of physical contact. The defense argued that the clothing could have been exposed to countless environments. That was true. The fiber was never presented as decisive. The DNA remained decisive. The fiber simply added context. Another detail emerged from the vehicle: the coffee cup. The original cup had been preserved as evidence. There was no usable DNA from the outside, but the laboratory found a partial fingerprint on the lid. It did not match Carter. It did not match Laura. It was too incomplete for identification. Again, a dead end. But the investigators refused to invent an answer. They marked it unknown. That word appeared repeatedly in the case. Unknown, unknown, unknown. For decades, those words had dominated Laura's file. Now they were disappearing one by one. Unknown suspect. Solved. Unknown DNA. Identified. Unknown vehicle. Partially explained. Unknown timeline. Reconstructed. Unknown motive. Still unknown. That final word remained. And perhaps it always would. The investigators reviewed Carter's financial records. Nothing suggested robbery. Nothing suggested extortion. Nothing suggested financial gain. There was no obvious motive. That made the murder appear more opportunistic. Carter may have encountered Laura. He may have followed her. He may have confronted her. Then something happened. Something escalated. And within minutes, Laura was dead. The absence of motive was frustrating. But prosecutors knew motive was not required for a conviction. The evidence showed responsibility. The reason could remain unanswered. Still, Shaw wanted to know whether there had been earlier warning signs. He searched Carter's background. There were no murder charges, no serious violent conviction, no obvious history of attacks. There were a few complaints, arguments, threats, one domestic disturbance, nothing that predicted murder. That discovery made the case even more unsettling. Carter had not looked like a monster. He had looked ordinary. That was precisely what made the case frightening. The most dangerous people do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they look like neighbors, co-workers, fathers, mechanics, men standing in grocery store lines, People whose lives continue normally after someone else's life has been destroyed. For Laura's family, that was difficult to accept. They had spent years imagining the killer as someone obviously dangerous, someone who must have looked suspicious, someone who must have frightened people. Instead, Carter had lived quietly. That reality forced the family to confront another painful truth. The person responsible had not been hiding in a dark room for 40 years. He had been living in daylight. The investigation eventually uncovered photographs of Carter from different stages of his life: 25, 35, 45, 55, 65. The face changed. The eyes remained. Daniel looked at the photographs and wondered how many times Carter had looked at himself in a mirror and remembered Laura. He would never know. Carter never explained. During sentencing, he remained largely silent. He expressed no detailed confession, no complete account, no explanation that could fill the missing years. The court could punish him. It could not force him to reveal what happened. That became the final frustration of the case. The evidence had answered who. It could not answer why. It could not reconstruct every movement. It could not reveal every thought. And it could not give Laura's family the final conversation they deserved. But the family had something they had never possessed before: certainty. The uncertainty had been its own form of suffering. Every unknown person became a possibility. Every dark pickup looked suspicious. Every phone call created hope. Every false lead reopened the wound. For nearly 40 years, Laura's family had lived inside that cycle. Now it was over. There would be no more false suspect. No more wondering whether the killer was still alive. No more looking at strangers and asking whether they knew something. There was a name. There was evidence. There was a verdict. And there was a grave. After the trial, Daniel visited Laura's grave alone. He brought the photograph from the courtroom. He stood there for several minutes without speaking. Then he said that they had finally found him. The wind moved through the trees. Nothing else happened. No dramatic sign. No sudden revelation. Just silence. But this silence was different. For years, silence had meant uncertainty. Now it meant peace. Not complete peace. Never complete. But enough. The cold case had finally stopped chasing the family, and perhaps that was the greatest victory. Not the headline. Not the arrest. Not the verdict. The end of the waiting. The end of wondering. The end of waking up every morning with the same unanswered question: who did this? The answer had arrived through science. A microscopic trace. A genetic pattern. A laboratory result. Something invisible had crossed 39 years and found the person responsible. That was why the case stunned investigators. They had expected old evidence to be useless. Instead, it became the strongest evidence in the entire investigation. The DNA did not care that Carter had grown old. It did not care that witnesses had forgotten. It did not care that detectives had retired. It did not care that the road had changed. It simply remained, waiting. And when investigators finally asked the right question, it answered. Laura Bennett disappeared in 1987. For decades, the world moved forward without her. Technology changed. Buildings disappeared. Families grew. Children became parents. Parents became grandparents. The people who knew Laura aged. Some died. But the case remained. A small file. A box of evidence. A photograph. A name. Then science opened the box again, and the past came rushing back. That is the strange power of a cold case. Time can bury almost everything, but not always the truth. Sometimes the truth is microscopic. Sometimes it sits in a laboratory freezer. Sometimes it waits in a cardboard evidence box. Sometimes it survives longer than the people who created it. And when the right investigator comes along, the smallest surviving trace can become louder than 39 years of silence. The Texas road where Laura disappeared still carries traffic. Most drivers pass without knowing her name. They see field, tree, fences, a stretch of pavement disappearing into the distance. But somewhere beneath the ordinary landscape is a history that refuses to vanish. A young woman drove home one evening. She never arrived. A family waited. A community wondered. Investigators searched. The case went cold. And then, almost 40 years later, DNA brought the answer back, not with a dramatic confession, not with a killer walking into a police station, not with a witness suddenly remembering everything, with science, with patience, with evidence that had refused to disappear. The cold case was solved. But Laura's story was never really about the man who killed her. It was about the life he could not erase. Her family remembered her. The photographs preserved her. The investigators protected the evidence. And the DNA preserved one final connection to the woman whose life had been taken. Carter could outlive the crime. He could move away. He could change jobs. He could grow old. But he could not outrun the smallest trace he left behind. 39 years after that lonely road went silent, the silence finally broke. And this time, it spoke Laura's name. The case should have ended with the verdict. On paper, it had. The defendant had been convicted. The family had received an answer. The evidence had been explained. The decades-old file could finally be closed, but investigators knew something still bothered them. The second DNA profile, the unexplained vehicle evidence, the missing hour, the possibility that the crime scene had contained more than one person's genetic material. And once a cold case has been open for nearly 40 years, investigators learn one dangerous lesson. Solving the central mystery does not always mean every mystery has disappeared. Detective Martin Shaw refused to ignore the unidentified DNA. The profile was weak, incomplete, but it existed, and it came from evidence associated with Laura. The first priority was determining whether the profile had any forensic value. The laboratory repeated the testing. The result was the same: a partial male profile. Not enough markers for a definitive identification. Not enough quality for a standard database hit, but enough to compare against specific individuals. Investigators began with the people closest to Laura: family, friends, co-workers, anyone who might have had innocent contact with her clothing. One by one, the profiles were excluded. Then they checked emergency personnel who had handled the scene. Excluded. Medical personnel. Excluded. Investigators who had processed the evidence. Excluded. The profile remained. Unknown. That word again. Unknown. The same word that had haunted Laura's case since 1987. But now it carried a different meaning. The original unknown had been a complete stranger. This one was a biological trait. It might mean nothing, or it might mean everything. The laboratory warned investigators not to overinterpret it. DNA can travel. DNA can transfer. A microscopic profile does not automatically tell investigators when or how it arrived. The responsible thing was to remain cautious. Shaw agreed, but he also knew that cold cases often turn on details nobody expects. So the team began reviewing the original evidence collection process. Who had touched Laura's clothing? Who had moved the body? Who had photographed the scene? Who had packaged the evidence? The chain of custody was examined line by line. Nothing immediately appeared wrong. The evidence had been properly handled. The unknown profile was not obvious contamination. That made the mystery harder. Investigators then asked a different question. Could the profile belong to someone who had encountered Laura before the murder? A co-worker? A friend? Someone at the convenience store? Someone who had touched her clothing days earlier? That possibility remained. The DNA could not tell them whether contact occurred that night. The distinction was critical. They did not want to create another suspect simply because a genetic profile existed. The investigation had already shown what happened when theories outran evidence. Too many innocent people had once been dragged into the shadow of Laura's murder. This time, investigators wanted facts. They returned to the convenience store. The original building was gone. A new business stood on the site. But the owner from 1987 had kept a box of old documents, receipts, employee schedules, maintenance records, insurance papers. Most were irrelevant. Then investigators found a handwritten notebook. The store owner had recorded unusual incidents. One entry was dated the night Laura disappeared. Customer argument near parking lot. No names, no details. But there was a time. 7:11 p.m. That was significant. Laura had been seen at the store around 7:02. Her car was believed to have left shortly afterward. The notebook suggested an argument had occurred minutes later. The owner had not remembered it during the original investigation, perhaps because he had not been at, perhaps because he had forgotten, or perhaps because the argument seemed ordinary. The investigators searched for employees who had worked that shift. One was still alive. She was 73. When asked about the night, she remembered a woman standing beside a car. She remembered a man. She remembered tension. But she could not identify either person. Then she remembered something. The man had been wearing a dark jacket. That detail matched the fiber found on Laura's clothing. Again, not proof, but another piece. The unidentified DNA profile was still unresolved. Investigators considered whether the man from the store could have been Carter. The timeline allowed it. Carter's employment records showed he had left work at 6:41. The store was roughly 20 minutes away. He could have arrived before Laura. He could have waited. He could have followed her. The timeline fit, but the investigators still lacked direct evidence. Then came a breakthrough from an unexpected source, an old photograph. The store had taken promotional photographs in 1987. The images were not connected to the murder. They showed the store's exterior, customers, employee, card. The investigators enlarged the background. There was a dark pickup, parked near the side of the building. The license plate was partially visible. They enhanced the image. The plate matched Carter's truck. The photograph was not taken on the exact minute of Laura's disappearance, but the date stamp on the original film indicated it had been taken that same evening. For the first time, Carter's presence at the store was visually supported. He had lied when he said he had never been there. The defense argued that the photograph did not prove he interacted with Laura. True, but it proved something important. Carter's memory was false. He had told investigators he did not visit the store that evening. The photograph showed his truck there. That contradiction became another piece of the prosecution's narrative. The investigators then examined the photograph more closely. Laura's sedan was visible in the distance. 2 vehicles. Same location. Same evening. Minutes apart. The discovery sent a shock through the team. The 2 cars had been photographed at the same place. This was the missing connection. Not speculation. Not memory. Not inference. A photograph. The image was grainy, but unmistakable. Laura's sedan. Carter's pickup. The same parking lot. The same night. The same narrow window of time. Investigators compared the vehicle position. Laura's car was near the front entrance. Carter's truck was parked farther away. That meant he could have watched her leave without being noticed. It also explained the witness statement about a dark pickup behind Laura. Carter may have waited until she drove away, then followed. The timeline became almost painfully clear. Laura enters the store. Carter is already nearby. Laura leaves. Carter follows. Hale sees the pickup behind her. The cars turn onto the county road. The road becomes empty. Then the crime. For decades, investigators had been missing the first link. Now they had it, and it was sitting inside an old photograph. The image was presented to the court during a later evidentiary review. The defense challenged its authenticity. Experts examined the film, the date, the development process, the image quality. Nothing suggested manipulation. The photograph was genuine. The evidence was genuine, and it placed Carter at the location. Still, the unidentified DNA remained. Investigators wondered whether the second profile belonged to someone who had been at the store. They searched the photograph for other people. Several figures appeared in the background. Most could not be identified. One man stood near the entrance. His face was hidden. The image was too poor to determine who he was. It was frustrating. The team had a DNA profile. They had a photograph. They had a possible second person, but no name. The investigation expanded again. Former store employees were contacted. Customers were identified where possible. Most had died or moved away. One former employee remembered a regular customer who sometimes spoke with Carter. His name was Stephen Malloy. Malloy had worked nearby. He was known to spend evenings at the store. Investigators checked his history. He had no criminal record, no connection to Laura, No known connection to the murder. His DNA was tested. Not a match. Another dead end. The second profile remained unidentified. At that point, prosecutors advised the investigators not to let the unknown profile overshadow the solved case. Carter had already been convicted. The remaining DNA did not undermine the conviction. It simply represented another unanswered question. But Shaw could not let it go. He knew what unanswered questions did to families. He had seen it happen with Laura. One unknown had survived for 39 years. He did not want another one to survive simply because nobody had the patience to pursue it. So investigators revisited the old case of the 17-year-old girl who disappeared in 1985. They compared locations. They compared circumstances. They compared the type of vehicle reported by witnesses. The similarities were uncomfortable. A young woman, a rural route, a dark vehicle. No body recovered. No suspect identified. But similarities are not evidence. The cases remain separate. Still, the possibility was documented. The investigators sent the unidentified DNA for comparison against evidence from the 1985 case. The result was negative. No match. The connection disappeared. Again, the case narrowed. Carter was responsible for Laura's murder. The second profile was likely unrelated, but there was another possibility. The profile could have come from an individual who had touched Laura's clothing before the murder. That could explain its presence without creating another suspect. The team accepted the uncertainty. Not every mystery has a dramatic answer. Sometimes evidence simply stops. That was difficult for Shaw, but it was honest. And honesty mattered, because the investigation had already demonstrated the danger of forcing evidence to fit a story. The case had survived for decades because investigators had refused to fabricate certainty. Now they had a conviction based on strong evidence. They would not damage it by inventing another villain. Meanwhile, Laura's family began the painful process of reclaiming her story. For years, her identity had been tied to the words missing and murder victim. Now they wanted people to remember the woman before the crime. Laura loved music. She collected old records. She laughed loudly. She hated being late. She loved coffee. She called her brother almost every Sunday. She wanted to travel. She had plans. She had a future. That future had been stolen. The case had been solved. But Laura deserved to be more than the mystery surrounding her death. Daniel began speaking publicly. Not about Carter, about Laura. He told reporters that the DNA match was important, but it was not the thing he wanted people to remember. He wanted people to remember his sister, the young woman whose life had been reduced to a case number for decades. That changed the tone of the coverage. The headlines still screamed, "Texas cold case solved. DNA match stuns investigators." But beneath the headlines was a human story, a woman, a family, a lifetime interrupted. The investigation also became a lesson for law enforcement. The original team had not failed because they were careless. They had worked with the technology available to them. They collected evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They preserved biological material. They documented the scene. What they could not do was see the future. Modern DNA analysis gave investigators a tool the original detectives never had. That was the difference. The evidence had not become more truthful. The technology had become more capable of reading it. That distinction mattered, because somewhere in Texas, in a secure evidence facility, another box might contain another cold case, another piece of clothing, another biological sample, another microscopic trace, waiting. That was the lesson Shaw carried with him. Never assume old evidence is useless. Never assume time has erased everything. Never assume an unanswered question will remain unanswered forever, because science changes. Databases grow. Technology improves. And people who believe they were safe can discover decades later that they were never truly free from the evidence they left behind. Carter had lived nearly 40 years believing the past was buried. Then a laboratory report arrived, a DNA match, a name, an arrest, a courtroom, a verdict. Everything changed in weeks, but the evidence had been waiting since 1987. The road had been waiting. The photographs had been waiting. The case file had been waiting, and Laura's family had been waiting. The cold case did not suddenly become solved. It had been solving itself quietly for decades. The final piece was simply the technology capable of revealing it. And somewhere inside that truth was the most haunting fact of all. The killer did not escape the past. He merely outlived everyone who remembered it, until science remembered for them. The old evidence room was almost empty when Detective Martin Shaw returned for the last time. Most of the boxes from Laura Bennett's case had already been photographed, cataloged, and returned to long-term storage. The investigation had reached its legal conclusion. Michael Carter had been convicted. The family had an answer. The county had a name to attach to the crime. But Shaw stood alone beneath the fluorescent lights, staring at the shelves, because he knew that solving a case was not the same as understanding everything that had happened. He pulled Laura's file from the shelf. The cardboard folder looked fragile. Inside were photographs from 1987, statements, map, laboratory reports, handwritten notes, and the original evidence log. Shaw turned the pages slowly. Then he stopped. There was a notation beside one item, recovered near vehicle. The description was vague. The item was listed as a small metal object. No photograph, no detailed analysis, no explanation, just one sentence. Shaw searched the storage records. The object had never been tested. He requested the evidence. Several days later, a technician brought him a sealed envelope. Inside was a small metal pendant. It was tarnished. The chain was broken. The pendant was shaped like a tiny cross. Shaw stared at it. He immediately remembered the old witness statement. Robert Hale had described a white object hanging from the rearview mirror of the dark pickup. Carter had owned a religious medal, but this was not proof. The pendant had been found near Laura's car, not inside Carter's truck. It could have belonged to Laura. It could have belonged to anyone. Still, Shaw sent it for examination. The laboratory found no usable DNA, no fingerprints, nothing. Another dead end. But Shaw noticed something else. The pendant had a small scratch across the back. A letter had been carved into the metal. M. One letter. Nothing more. Carter's first name was Michael. Again, coincidence. The pendant could have belonged to someone else. The investigators refused to overstate it. But the object became another strange detail in a case already filled with them. The more they reconstructed the night, the more they realized how many small moments had been lost. Laura's last conversation, the first confrontation, the exact moment she left the road, the moment the vehicle stopped, the final seconds beneath the tree. Those moments were gone. No forensic technology could recreate them perfectly. That was the limit of the investigation, and perhaps the hardest truth for the family to accept. A solved case does not mean every question has an answer. Sometimes it means the evidence has become strong enough to establish what happened without explaining every second. For Daniel Bennett, that distinction mattered. He told Shaw that he had spent decades imagining the worst. Now he finally understood something. He did not need to know every word Laura had spoken. He needed to know that she had not been forgotten. That became the emotional center of the case. Laura had not disappeared into an anonymous file. Her family had carried her. The detectives had preserved her evidence. And eventually, modern science had carried the investigation across decades. The final report described the case as resolved. But Shaw refused to use the word finished. He believed the case had entered a different stage. Not active investigation. Not unresolved mystery. A historical record. A warning. A lesson. A reminder that evidence can survive long after human memory fades. The story attracted national attention again. News organizations revisited the original photographs. Some showed Laura smiling. Others showed the abandoned vehicle. The contrast was devastating. One photograph showed a young woman full of light. Another showed the place where that life ended. The public wanted the details. How did DNA identify Carter? Why had he not been caught early? Why did investigators suspect him decades later? Why had the evidence survived? The answers were surprisingly simple. Technology, persistence, preservation, time. The DNA had not suddenly appeared. It had always existed. The difference was that modern testing could extract a profile from material that had been nearly meaningless in 1987. Then genealogy narrowed the search. Then investigators built a family tree. Then they identified Carter. Then they obtained a reference sample. Then the direct comparison confirmed the match. No single miracle, just a chain, one link after another. That was why the case stunned investigators. The breakthrough looked sudden. It was not. It was the result of years of preservation and modern forensic science finally intersecting. The story also changed the way the community remembered 1987. People who had been children at the time began telling their own memory. They remembered the newspaper headline, the police cars, the search parties, the fear. Some remembered their parents locking doors early. Others remembered seeing Laura's photograph on television. The murder had become part of local memory. Now the memory had an ending. At a small memorial service, Laura's family placed flowers near the road where her car had been found. There was no large ceremony, no cameras, just family, a photograph, a few words, and a silence that felt different from the silence of 1987. Daniel stood beside the photograph. He said that his sister deserved to be remembered for how she lived, not only how she died. That sentence was repeated by reporters afterward. It became the most human line in the entire story, because true crime has a tendency to turn people into mystery. Laura had been described for decades as a victim, but before she was a victim, she was a person. She had favorite songs. She had favorite foods. She had habits. She had dreams. She had a family. The murder was one night. Her life was 24 years. That distinction became important. The case had been solved. Now the family wanted Laura back in the store. Not literally. That was impossible. But in memory, in photographs, in conversations, in the ordinary details that had nothing to do with murder. That was how they began healing. Slowly. Not forgetting. Never forgetting. Just learning to remember without waiting for the phone to ring. Meanwhile, Carter's conviction remained under appeal. His attorneys challenged several aspects of the forensic evidence. The process continued through the court. The family waited again. The irony was painful. They had already spent decades waiting. Now they had to wait for the final legal process. But this time, the waiting was different. There was no unknown suspect, no endless possibility. The evidence was public. The verdict existed. The case had been heard. The appeal could challenge legal questions. It could not return the case to 1987. The road remained. The evidence remained. Laura's memory remained. And the DNA remained. The appellate court ultimately upheld the conviction. The ruling brought another wave of headline. The cold case was officially settled. No retrial. No reversal. No escape through technicality. Carter remained responsible in the eyes of the law. For investigators, the final ruling provided closure. For the family, it provided something even more valuable: finality. They no longer had to wonder whether another hearing might erase everything. The legal process was complete. Laura's name could finally be separated from uncertainty, but the story still carried one haunting mystery: the unidentified DNA profile. Investigators never found a definitive match. It remained in the evidence database as an unknown male profile. Perhaps it belonged to someone who had innocently encountered Laura. Perhaps it came from an unrelated contact. Perhaps it was transferred before the murder. There was no proof of another killer, no evidence that Carter had an accomplice, no basis for reopening the case. The profile remained a question. But unlike the original mystery, this question did not erase the answer. Carter was identified. Carter was convicted. Laura's family had justice. The unknown profile became a footnote rather than the center of the story. That distinction mattered, because sometimes investigators must accept uncertainty without allowing it to destroy what they already know. The case had taught them that. The truth does not always arrive as a complete story. Sometimes it arrives in fragments: a photograph, a witness statement, a vehicle record, a DNA match, a forgotten note, one fragment at a time. Eventually, enough fragments form a picture. Laura's picture was not perfect, but it was clear enough. A young woman drove into darkness. A man followed. A confrontation occurred. Laura died. The killer left biological evidence. Then he disappeared into ordinary light. For decades, the world moved on. But the evidence did not. That was the thread connecting everything. The evidence did not age the way people did. It did not forget. It did not reinterpret memory. It simply remained. And when investigators finally returned to it, they discovered that the smallest surviving trace could overturn 39 years of uncertainty. The story became an example for other cold case units across the country. Preserve everything. Retest old biological material. Revisit old assumptions. Talk to witnesses again when possible. Examine forgotten photographs. Read the margins. Look at the details that seemed insignificant decades earlier, because the evidence that solves a cold case is not always dramatic. It may be one sentence, one photograph, one laboratory sample, one object sitting inside an evidence envelope. Something that seemed meaningless in 1987 can become decisive decades later. That was Laura's legacy to the investigators. Not just the conviction, the lesson. The case reminded them that time is not always the enemy. Sometimes time gives science an advantage. A database grows. Technology improves. New forensic techniques appear. Old evidence becomes readable. The past becomes searchable. And suddenly, the person who believed the years had protected him discovers that the years were actually collecting evidence against him. Carter had lived nearly 4 decades outside the reach of the investigation. He had believed the case was buried, but it had never been buried. It had been preserved. Every time the evidence box moved, the truth moved with it. Every time the file was archived, the truth was archived. Every time someone remembered Laura's name, the case remained alive. And eventually, someone opened the file again. That was all it took. One detective, one old box, one modern laboratory, one genetic profile, one name. Then everything changed. The Texas road still looks ordinary. That is perhaps the strangest part. There is nothing about it that announces what happened. No permanent marker, no flashing sign, no warning. Just asphalt, fields, trees, sky. But for the people who know the story, the road is no longer ordinary. It is where a family lost a daughter, where investigators began a search, where a cold case was born, and where decades later, the truth finally found its way back. Laura's family still visits her grave. They still tell stories about her. They still remember her laugh. But they no longer have to say, "We don't know who did this." They know. That sentence changed everything. Not because it erased the pain, because it removed the uncertainty surrounding it. For nearly 40 years, Laura's family had lived with a question. Now they live with an answer. And sometimes, in a cold case, that is the closest thing to peace the living will ever receive. The final evidence report was signed. The file was updated. The case status changed. Solved. 1 word. 5 letters. 39 years of waiting behind it. And somewhere inside an evidence archive, Laura's original clothing remains preserved. The DNA trace remains. The photographs remain. The old reports remain, waiting quietly among thousands of other cases, because there will always be another cold case, another family waiting, another evidence box, another forgotten detail, another tiny trace that may one day become the loudest voice in the room. Laura's case proved that the past does not always stay buried. Sometimes it waits. And when the right person opens the right file at the right time, the dead can finally speak. Not through ghosts, not through miracles, through evidence, through science, through facts that survive the people who tried to forget them. 39 years after Laura disappeared, the silence finally broke. And this time, nobody could pretend they had not heard it.